Hey, everybody. Welcome. If you're watching this on my channel, welcome back. If you're watching this on Alison's channel, hello for the first time. Moyer. And what you're about to listen to, though we don't know what it will be, is probably a very far long overdue, although perfect and divine timing conversation between myself and Alison McDowell, who is here. And we've been cross-pollinating for the past several weeks. And it's been, for me at least, alternately like a relief and also terrifying. It's nice to know that there's like, sometimes my mind starts to feel a little John Nashy. And so it's nice to know there's another one out there, but the size and scope of my mind map has like quadrupled because of the cross-pollination. So anyway, Alice, nice to see you today. I'm looking forward.
Oh, thanks, Emily. And sort of just a little background. So lately I've been, I think you inquired like a while back because we were doing some talk around the Santa Fe Institute and different things. And I kind of was like, oh, like I'm just not doing interview. Like I'm in this place right now. I feel like I'm just sort of zooming in on certain things. And, but you know, we had been in touch and you were like, you should really look at this series, you know, which we'll talk about, the OA. And there was so much of that. And I'm trying to exercise a little bit of my my skills. So my friend Steffers, who used to blog over at A Piece of Mindful, she's very good at the media analysis. And I don't do a lot of like you know, whatever Twilight language encrypted stuff. That's not my, I respect it, but it isn't my wheelhouse. So when you said this, I was like, oh great, I can try to practice some of these things, like incorporating these larger themes into this narrative. And it really became this great back and forth by email. So anyway, for that's sort of how it came about, that it seems like a good time to have this conversation, even though technically I've kind of been off in my wandering around my own area for a bit.
Yeah,
so
we have to do that sometimes, right? Like it's just, sometimes it's like be out there and interacting with everybody, and sometimes like zoom in and do your thing. You know, I've had the series that I did a couple of years back on the OA. It was, for me, it was like a combined thread with sort of synchronistically with Elisa Lam, is probably one of the most commented on and requested for reposting of things that I've ever done, as well as, and this was kind of where you went as part of your looking into it, my series on sugar as programmable matter. People are always saying, do you have anything more to say about this? When are you going to do more on it? And like, there wasn't, I don't want to, like at a certain point, like you've said what you've said. And if you just add to it because people like it, it starts to lose its sort of, you know, like the spontaneity, whatever it was. But I know people have wanted me to update it. So when you asked about it, I was like, oh, great, this is awesome. Like, well, we can overlay this on top of the OA, right? It's just, it's the gift that keeps on giving on some levels, the OA, right? But
exactly. I got some like informal health advice, right? Like get your act together around your body. And yeah, I look at sugar in a very different way. So thank you for that.
Absolutely. So, I mean, I have, you know, I think like I was in the extremities of that idea when I was going through that process of you know, like that whole series came about in like the weeks after my mentor in nutrition had passed away. And it was like this just constant influx of information. And I was very much living those ideas in terms of what I was doing with my body. And like over time, you can't stay that extreme for forever. So I have sort of this interesting observation of myself when I go through phases where I am restricting sugar completely and other phases where I'm allowing it, and just kind of seeing the change in perception and whatnot. But yeah, this is no better person to complicate an already complicated topic with, right? So anywho, well, I looked at you know, I looked at your slideshow, which I love how organized you are, and I wish I was that organized. And even within that slideshow, like there was a lot of stuff that has been no way talked about between you and I in our back and forth, or in the conversation we had a few weeks ago. But you had things as part of that slideshow that are serious threads that I track with other people, whether they be Michael or Danny or Nish or other people I am in ongoing conversations with about things. Some of them, like, I couldn't understand for a minute why they were in the slideshow about the thing you're talking about, but these are all central to my narratives about a variety of things. And so like it has to be a node or a dot somewhere on your map as well, because it seems to be like we just, you know, looking at everything from different sides of the room, but like the map is essentially the same. So However we want to sort of proceed through this.
Well, and I can just mention too, so the other piece of this for me in terms of like the synchronicity. So like I'm not driving so much lately, so I had put off getting my oil changed, and it was like coming on like 5 months. So I'm like, okay, I got to go down to Raphael in South Philly and get the oil changed. And it was one of these first nice spring days. I'm in Philly, and I was rushing back for something, but he said, well, I can get it done in a couple hours if you just want to poke around town a little bit and then come back. And so I was like, no, I'll just get it tomorrow. And I'm like, no, I will stay. And so I ended up winding my way through South Philadelphia, which has its own sort of cultural character, which it's on the coastal plain. It's very flat. There's not a lot of trees. There's lots of window decorations and ornaments. It's very culturally diverse, Italian, Southeast Asian, a lot of stuff going on. And I wound myself up through to Queen Village, which is a neighborhood where my kid used to go to school. And I got a coffee and I sat down and I had a book and I had like an hour more. So I thought, oh, this is so nice. I want to go somewhere green and sit outside. But there's not a lot of that in the city, right downtown. And a couple of places were these two cemeteries that are right next to each other on 3rd Street, 3rd and Pine. Old Pine Cemetery with the church, and then St. Peter's. And I don't ever go to St. Peter's, but that day the sun was shining in just a certain way with the daffodils. And I'm like, no, I'm going to go there. And then all of these things unfolded from this, like literally an hour and a half walk around South Philadelphia. Like they were shouting at me. Mm-hmm. Like, here's the story, right? Here's Dallas, like the first tombstone I saw, which these are, I know of your work with Michael Wan, generally, and this idea of interpreting landscapes and the significance of these historic settings. And so this is an old cemetery, late 18th, early 19th. Most of the tombstones are erased. You can't read them. But this first one was clearly done in granite, and it was the Dallas family. Like you could clearly read it. Well, I had to get back to go see my friend, to do a podcast with my friend Lynn, who's in Dallas. And so I'm like, this is a little odd. And the Dallas family is connected to the Beish and the Ben Franklin. So it's, but that jumped out. And then, I needed to get some, I saw this tombstone that was pyramidal and it was unusual. So I'm like, well, I got to go look at that. And there were feathers on the ground all around. So I'm like collecting all the feathers. So it unfolded from that point. So I started a slide deck about that. And then later on, it evolved into a mosaic mural, which was on my way back, with mirrors and symbolism. And this guy, Isaiah Zagar, who is known in Philadelphia for his very colorful, eclectic tile work on the exterior of buildings, especially in that part of town. But I'd never really paid attention to it as a message. And this particular mural was like a, 50-foot long wall. And it was telling a story of, it seemed to be like integral theory and, axolotls and chinampas and these other things. And I'm like, what is going on? So anyway, when you saw that slide deck, initially I started that, and then I started interleaving the OA stuff. And then some of these ideas that my friend Steffers was sharing with me about morphogenesis and complexity. And I just kept throwing it all in. So it's still very erratic. And eventually one day I'm going to walk all the way through it, but it just bubbled up. So anyway, that's why when you were looking at it, you're just like, I don't know what I'm looking at, but it all seems to connect.
So what you said happened is exactly like the sort of mystical toponymy, right? Or that actually, I think that idea comes from Michael Hoffman, right? Who like wrote the book, I forget what is his book called? Hold on a second. Author Michael Hoffman. He is kind of like, he talks a lot about James Shelby Downard. Right. His book is, he wrote a book on Twilight language, and then he wrote another book, a book on secret societies and psychological warfare. Right. He's written lots of books, tons of them actually, but those are his two, like, most famous in sort of the kind of community that I sort of, follow with and track and whatnot. But it is this, I can't tell you how many times, like Michael and I have done a show in the morning, and then somehow everything we talked about that morning will present itself out there in the real world. And then when the show goes out a few days or a few weeks later or whatever I'm talking about is going on for a lot of people that are listening. Like they'll send me a note and say, oh my God, like you know, like my boyfriend was sitting and was listening to your show and I was in the other room and you said a sentence. And at the same time, I read the sentence in the book that I was reading, or the exact same thing happened to me that day that you talked about then, right? So this would be like a massive level of control if this was being like all architectured, right? If somebody was like mapping this out. So I think there's a couple of things. I think there definitely is some, obviously we have like some synchronicities that seem very, very, very organic, and maybe, right? And others that seem obviously completely, like when you're talking about something and then your phone shows you an ad for it, we know what that is. And then there's all these places sort of in between, right? Where you wonder. And so you could kind of think it out and go, okay, this would be way too many things that would have to come together for this to be completely controlled. But the way I see it is two things. I see it as if we are living in some sort of system that has like a geometric or an algorithmic, or even if you know what gematria is, like speaking something into existence, like the vibration of the sound of the word. If something is being coded for, it's going to express in like every possible variety of what that thing means, right? And so some of them will be like technological or controlled in nature, and others will be natural spontaneity, and then all these different varieties. So I think that it's, you know, the question of, well, like, depends the kind of world we live in, right? Is it a friendly or a dangerous place? Are we already in a simulation? Or are we trying to prevent one? Like, we don't know. And so, right, like that, so it's hard to say. And the only answer that I'm ever certain is correct is both and. It's both things, and all the things we're also not thinking.
All this other stuff we don't know. Yeah,
exactly. Right. And then the other thing is, are you generating the synchronicity field yourself, or are you picking up on a synchronicity field someone else or something else has generated? Right. And both things are powerful experiences. One of the things that Michael and I came across early in our work together, and I asked you for a different reason if you were familiar with John Lilly.
Okay.
But he's an interesting person, and a couple of the people who come from this like neuroscience physicist, but also psychedelic realm, like that have been discarded as cuckoos, like John Lilly and Timothy Leary and whatever. When you actually look deep into their work is actually more operant, in my opinion, than some of the people that we're told now are the experts or the ones we should listen to or look at or whatever. And I think that, you know, maybe System just wanted to use their work for something different than they did. So they helped drive them.
I think Lilly was the hap of the dolphin world.
Right. 100%, right?
Yeah.
But if you look at like, even like Timothy Leary, like who everyone has lots of questions about, depending on your opinion of him, his like 8-circuit model of consciousness and some of the stuff that he was laying down as ideas, like, oh, wait a second, I can completely see how many aspects of cybernetics and MKL's trial and all kinds of other things were exactly that, right? And so like, if his idea for it was something different than what a system wanted to use it for, not saying he's good, bad, or anything else, then driving him cuckoo, but extracting ideas from that you can use in a more sort of methodical or corporatized or cybernetics type of way than what event I think happens. But one of the things with John Lilly, and there's a lot of things with John Lilly, he was into all kinds of shit. And actually people don't recognize.
He started out in Philadelphia, you know. Like his graduate work was in Philly. Yeah, that was very shocking to me.
And then he spent time in California, in Southern California, where I lived, and he spent time in the Delaware, Baltimore area where Michael grew up. And we
I didn't
find him
realize
being in locations at times, but so many of the lesser known mind control programs also they center around some of his work with, you know, sensory deprivation and stimulation of the brain and creating, you know, agents and all of this kind of stuff, but also the dolphins, right? Like the the Flipper series, the television show Flipper was like highly used in programming of children of a specific era.
Wow, I hadn't thought about it like that.
Yeah, and there's a whole strain of people who've been through projects who have memories and talk about this underwater training, for myself as well, that was about learning to sort of breathe underwater, or learning to sort of perceive or generate sort of information differently underwater, being able to stay under for long periods of time. There's all kinds of stuff, right? So even the parts of his work that like sound the craziest, there's extractions that
I think that they've known about this stuff for so long. I mean, and even going to most recently looking more into revisiting Michael Levin's work around bioelectricity and field theory, and all of that is framed as regenerative medicine. But it's going back to Mesmer in the 18th century. And I was within the past year at a talk at the American Philosophical Society, downtown next to Independence Hall. These are the elite people, and it was a lecture about like an 18th century scientist. And literally the guy came from Wales. He was the guest lecturer, and he made fun of Mesmer in the first like 15 minutes. And so when they dismiss out of hand, and it wasn't particularly relevant, but it had to be dismissed, because I think that actually feels like the waveforms, the electricity, the water memory, the communication, like there is a communication happening, but we just don't identify it. And it's maybe not even straight up like psychic per se, but like field, like being able to tap into a field. I feel like that's a lot of my work lately has been looking at social computing. And this, which was so ironic when you suggested that I take a look at the series. I'm so bad at like handling media that on Netflix, which is like I checked in as my husband. So some algorithm out there is going to think my husband is watching the OA over and over again. I'm sorry, like his profile is like now toxic with the OA. But it defaulted to the second season, and the first episode there was specifically of an augmented reality game. Now, if it had defaulted to the very first episode of the first season, I might not have stuck with it all the way, but like it knew that was the hook. Like there was something that was like, yeah, if Alison sees this, she'll stick with it. And
so this is fascinating. Okay, so two things. Remind me to get back to John Lilly, but I want to comment on what you just said. So I think I had said in our conversation, but if not, I certainly have talked about it publicly, about how the second season stands alone. Like the whole series, I like the whole series for different reasons, but it's almost like two different shows. And the second season, like you don't need to really know too much from the first season.
That's what I thought. I was like, well, it's kind of scattered, but I'll figure it out as I go along. I literally finished the whole second season and went to look for the next one and realized I had done it backwards.
Yeah, well, I've had that happen with shows before too, but that second season, there's the tone of it is very, very different. But what we had figured out was if you actually laid it over if you do the sort of forensic lead up on the Elisa Lam kind of situation,
right,
it really tells you what happened to her. Right. And she's one of the people who, like a lot of people who get into synchromysticism and stuff, get fixated on what happened to her because there were so many weird things that seem highly symbolic.
Right.
And Brett Marling seems particularly tapped in to some of that. And so that they are separate, right? But so it's been said publicly. And then also I even mentioned it to you that like, just watch the second season. It stands alone. You can kind of overlay it here. I really quickly want to say something about the John Lilly thing now. So one thing when we were starting to dig into this synchronicity, because as soon as Michael and I started working together, the amount of synchronicities like just started doubling, tripling, quadrupling, all crazy. And it was right at the beginning of lockdowns, right?
Okay.
So we were researching synchronicity, and one of the things we found about John Lilly, and I don't know, he has a book called Programming and Super Programming the Human Programming and Meta Programming the Human Supercomputer. I don't know if you've ever seen this book. I have it. I haven't read it yet. But we were digging around in a bunch of stuff, and we found this document called Echo, right? That talks about coincidence control. And I'll just show you here. This is like some manifesto or something that he wrote, right? So, and it talks about in 1974, Lilly's research using various psychoactive drugs led him to believe in the existence of a certain hierarchical group of cosmic entities. the lowest of which he later dubbed Earth Coincidence Control Office.
Ooh, interesting.
In an autobiography published jointly with his wife Antoinetta, to elaborate, there exists a cosmic coincidence control center with a galactic substation called a galactic coincidence control. Right within GCC is the solar system control unit, within which is the Earth Coincidence Control Office. And then here's the little manifesto.
Okay.
Lilly also wrote that there are 9 conditions that should be followed by people who seek to experience coincidence in their own lives. 1, you must know, assume, simulate our existence in echo. You must be willing to accept our responsibility for control of your coincidences. You must exert your best capabilities for your survival programs and your own development as an advanced member of ECHO's Earthside Corps of Controlled Coincidence Workers. You are expected to use your best intelligence in this service. You are expected to expect the unexpected every minute, every hour of every day, and of every night. You must be able to maintain full awareness no matter what events we arrange to happen to you. Some of these events will seem cataclysmic, catastrophic, overwhelming. Remember to stay aware no matter what happens, apparently happens to you. You are in our training program for life. There is no escape from it. We, not you, control the long-term coincidences. You, not we, control the shorter-term coincidences by your own efforts. Your major mission on Earth is to discover, create that which we do to control the long-term coincidence patterns. You are being trained on Earth to do this job. When your mission on planet Earth is completed, you will no longer be required to remain or return there. Remember, the motto passed to us from GCC via SSCU, cosmic love is absolutely ruthless and highly different. It teaches its lessons whether you like them, dislike them, or not. So it's kind of funny, right? But like, let's just say you have kids that are at a summer camp, let's say, right? Mm-hmm. And you have by your hooks and lures of like, oh, your child is gifted and talented, or maybe even just your kids stay for the after school program and some of them show some abilities in this and that. If you've like recruited a group of children that you're going to run through a bunch of tests, they're going to be more responsive to it if you're like, you have a mission and here is your mission, right? Like it sounds,
right.
But like these things really do get into the psyche of young people. And even when if they don't like literally remember it, it becomes part of their sort of, ongoing pattern of the way that they see and do things and whatnot. And so with that kind of thing in mind, Michael and I really began digging into synchronicities with the hope that we would be able to, I think in the beginning, we've had many sort of recalibrations and whatnot, figure out like what were the circumstances, like what were the things that could you generate a synchronicity? Like if you were going to generate one, what would be the things that like the factors that needed to combine? Or if you were on the receiving end, like how would you know, like what would be the factors that would kind of make you aware of like, oh, you had just received sort of a controlled, kind of thing coming at you. So I don't know that we ever completely got an answer, but it led us into some interesting places for sure. And in terms of what you talk about, this with game theory and with like predictive models and all of this kind of stuff, I think it's whatever is watching or whatever is collecting information, right? It's both trying to see, like if it predicts that, if it's trying to get us to do a specific thing, how accurate is their prediction that doing this will get us to do that? But I think they're also fascinated with the people who don't ever respond to that, despite all pushings and proddings. And so collecting information on that, because I almost think that they're more fascinated with that, like with the outliers.
Yeah.
Right. And trying to, even use information that they glean from the outlier to sort of create their next model, because eventually even people who are easy to predict and control become wise to something. And so if you can learn some little thing from the outlier of like the little dance they did before they realized, yeah, I'm not going to do that, they're trying to get me to do that, then right. Created the next lure for the person who's like one little bit wiser the next time or whatever. Right. So this is a long-term thing that's been going on. And I think it's just beginning to look different now, right? Here we are.
It's interesting because like JCR Licklider of DARPA, like his initial memo about the internet was like humorously addressed to like the members of the intergalactic network. Is the first thing that I saw when I don't know when that Lilly's piece came out, but I'm assuming it's probably a similar time frame.
Yeah. I think that was probably like 60s or 70s, like late 60s, early 70s.
Yeah, early 70s, yeah.
Something like that. So, okay, we had gone on back to the OA. All right. Okay. So like, let's start there, because when I looked at the OA, I guess I wasn't thinking about it in terms of, like blockchain ideas, but I was thinking about it in terms of like crowdsourcing or crowd sharing apps like Uber and like Postmates and TaskRabbit and all of this kind of stuff, right? I mean, I watched it when it first came out, so we weren't quite as far down I think the first time I watched it, I was still living in Chatsworth, so it had to be like 2016.
Yeah, it was early. I mean, it's old in blockchain years. I mean, when you think about like that's what was so surprising to me when I first saw them pull out that game. Yeah.
I mean, I think it's possible that like the whole, other than discussion of the fact that they were rewarded in tokens. So I'm sure we talked about Ethereum or something like that a little bit at some point in one of my conversations. Like I wasn't thinking about it in the terms that you are, but you saw I was able to create as many ideas and narratives and stories and ideas in like a different way as you are. And I think like both,
because yours was situated in your experience and your geography, right? With Lisa Lamb.
Yeah. Right. I mean, and just in other analysis we did of the whole show, like, I think that there's very much like all ideas that are put out there are being expressed like externally, like in the outer world, the larger universe, or however someone thinks about that. And then it's happening on the inside, on the cellular level. And I feel like what the work that you're sort of honed in on, like that's the space in between, right? Like there's a like that's like, I was looking at the thing you sent last night or yesterday. It had come up in my own feed and I had like marked it anyway, but I hadn't looked at it yet. So I did when you sent it. The guy talking to Lex Friedman about gap junctions and mind maps and things like that, right? So like there's two things that are connecting, but there's this space sort of in between, and it feels like that's like where a lot of your work is. That's where data from like the inner world and the outer world is starting to interact in this sort of predictive place to try and, I feel like for the people who are trying to discover something, trying to use the information and the energy that we generate to either power or power something or answer a problem they can't solve, right? That's a place where they're collecting it all and then creating an enclosure that people think is the real world, so they don't understand the importance of their own energy or their own ideas, right? They think the importance of everything is to earn tokens, to buy trinkets, right? But meanwhile, like literally, like some intelligent thing you say in the process of playing their game, they'll run back to the lab and test that out to see if that will like cool the machine on their nuclear reactor or whatever. Right?
And the interesting thing is like the other clip from this Friedman Levin talk, Levin is talking about hierarchical competencies within an organism. And so you've got like cells and tissues and organs in the body, and each of them has goals, but the people at the entities, the agents in the it's all driven in his perception as a engineer, as a goal-oriented behavior. And those above are deforming the choice architecture to impact those below, but those below don't know what's happening up there.
Yes, exactly.
They only know what's in their immediate vicinity. And so they're reactive to the conditions. And so they do the best they can within the conditions they're given, which is kind of like what Lilly was saying, right? Like be aware, you're going to have stuff happen to you and do your best, you know? And so for me, it's that hierarchy, but at some level, there's some other layer that understands more of what the simulation is doing and how they're changing the choice architecture, which, you know, my work around the token engineering, like that's going to be the game, is engineering the tokens. And there will be some play in there, right? Like if you dialed everything in so tightly and there was no choice, we wouldn't be interesting. Right. So it's like to create these guardrails within which the dynamics percolate up. And then as Melanie Swan, who is the blockchain cloud minds woman, saying, like, you enter into a group activity, whether that's in an embodied activity in the material world or a psychic activity in a psychic space, which, you know, I really think that these Facebook rooms, all of these ideas, these apps with the rooms are a precursor to a cloud mind, right? And they literally have said that they have a way of tagging your intellectual property contribution so that you'll get the micropayments later. Like, so just exactly as you said, if you say something brilliant in the context of some, you know, what are the Clubhouse chat, like it will be tagged, and then like Emily gets like the ka-ching, like little tokens if that little idea gets used somewhere over here in the giant modular computer. But
right, but it'll be like you'll get like a nickel for something that was like a $5 billion idea for like whatever the thing they're building, right?
But you might never even get to see the thing they're building. I mean,
right. You won't. Yeah. Or because they have signs around there saying there's radiation leaking, don't come here, right? Because if you came in there, you might like, you know, have access to other dimensions of reality or of your mind, but, you know, we'll let you think that. Okay, so with that gap junction thing was also interesting. The way that they titled it in the little video clip, or I don't know if you titled it that way or if that's how I think you titled it. You clicked from Lex Fridman's, and Lex Fridman is a whole other.
I know, but I mostly just pulled Levin because, like, I have to say, like, towards the end, it kind of got off the rails in terms of like some of the other stuff. Like, it was a 3-hour thing, and I was only pulling from, but there were some
you do that, yeah. I can't listen to 3 hours of Lex. I've tried.
I'm working on a quilt, so I can make my way through. But
he's painful to listen to on levels that it's fascinating that people will listen to that. But Danny and I have spent a lot of time critiquing him, and I have a lot of wild ideas about Lex Fridman. And also I cross with him on the trail out here on a semi-frequent basis. And there's
he's in Austin.
Oh yeah.
Oh, okay. There you go.
Multiple versions of him are in Austin. Let's put it that way. Okay. But this idea we're talking about, like gap junctions and mind melds, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Like I have two ideas that made me think of that, like for experiences that I've had in my life that I was trying to I've always been trying to classify or figure out like what was really going on there. And one of them is when during a specific period of my time of time for me, like when I would go to parties, and so underground rave scene in Los Angeles, or underground warehouse party scene in Los Angeles. And I was almost always on meth at this point. It was during my drug addicted years. Often like I would take psychedelics at the party or whatever. But I started closing my eyes and I'd have all these like really intense visuals that, you know, I've done mushrooms as a person not on meth since then, and it's like that as well, but it's a little bit different. Like the meth introduced some other part to it that is not the same, quite the same. But I would go to parties, I would have all these really intense visuals, and I would come home and like I would still be awake because I was on meth, and I would want to see the thing that I saw in my head again, right? And so I would go looking on the computer, usually on sites like DeviantArt or sometimes other, for trying to find something that looked like it. And sometimes I'd find literally the exact thing I had seen in my head, which started to lead me to wonder, like, and oftentimes the thing had posted while I was at the party. So it was like, was there some kind of mind meld going on that I was generating something and some artist who was up tiddling around on their online art computer thing, that they were picking up on that and drawing that, or were they doing that and my mind was like acting as the receiver type of thing, right? And it got to the point where like I that became a part of my party and my trip experience, was like, did it get to go home afterwards and like,
I know, it's like, did it
make this happen, right? And it happened for a particular point in my life. And then after I got clean, like I'm tired when I get home from parties now. So I go to sleep and I don't do it. And it's not quite the same. So there was that mind meld. And then the other scenario was during the meth years, I would display I display this in other ways throughout my life, but that's when I really started to notice there was something weird about it. Like I know things that I don't know how I know them. Like I will have memories of a situation that I couldn't possibly have been there for the situation, right? But I would sometimes, like if I couldn't get drugs from my usual connect for drugs, I don't know how I would do this, but I would find my way somehow to some place where there was somebody there selling the drugs that I want. And the way that I would do this would almost be like remembering some exchange I had with someone at so-and-so's house this many years ago. And they said there's a drug dealer that lives at this place. And I would somehow go there and find my way to the whole, and it'd be in the middle of the, like, right. The whole thing would be like, how is this happening? And like, right, kind of, if you watch a movie like Salt and Sea or something, which is a phenomenal movie with Val Kilmer, you'll see the level of like reconnaissance that was going on in his mind as he was having these experiences on meth and whatnot. So I never knew if it was that, if I'm just like constantly picking up, you know, that I have a good memory, as do you, constantly picking up little bits of information that are not part of my front awareness, but if I need them, I can go back and call on them. Yeah. Or am I sharing mental space with somebody via some sort of technology that was like in the drugs that I consumed, right? Yeah. So now I know where their drug dealer is, their other one, not the one that I know them from, or something like that, right? And when he was talking about the gap junction and the mind melds, and I went and looked up gap junctions and looked at some of the graphs and things like that, some of the graphs literally look like some of the kinds of visions I used to have in my head. Like, I think you can see how the technology works. Like, I think it can't hide itself from you, right? Yeah. You don't know you're looking at it when you're looking at it.
Exactly. Yeah. I actually ordered the book. I was a little surprised because in the clip, Levin said he went to, the guy's name was Werner Lowenstein. Mm-hmm. It was at Columbia and then later at Woods Hole. And so he was applying this idea of the gap junction. And I don't know if I'm articulating it totally correctly, but essentially it's this idea that like, it's electrical signaling and communications and the idea of boundaries. Like, where is the boundary that is an independent agent end and something else begins, whether that's a cell or a person, and that these gap junctions allowed communication among cells, but the cell would take in the information without any identification that the information had come from outside of itself. Mm-hmm. And so it was a flow of information. So you don't know that it's you or that it's not you, which is interesting if you think about it being applied to programs. Mm-hmm. And, you know, one of the things that I had come across, I don't know, a year or so ago at MIT, and again, this is just available as somebody's dissertation, you know, and it's out publicly available, which makes you wonder what the stuff that's not just put out like for the public, but it was synthetic programmable hallucinations. Mm-hmm. So in that, they have these pictures with someone with like, you know, like a big hair dryer kind of thing on their head, like helmet. But I don't think it's that. Like, I think they make it look like that so that they can say, see, we can do synthetic program in, you know, but you have to put all this equipment on. But I think probably that the science is further. And that guy came out of Los Angeles. He was a movie guy, the guy whose dissertation it was. So yeah, like it just makes you wonder. But anyway, so Werner Lowenstein had written, he's like, oh, I think he was an old guy when I saw him, and he was writing a book on quantum consciousness. Mm-hmm. But I don't know if that book ever got written, but it did. So I just ordered a copy last night to see what it says.
Yeah, I think that it's a big, I mean, I'm not saying I don't think they ever have experimented with lots of machines and tools. Obviously they have. But I think that quickly they realized that there was a psychic phenomena that was going on that was actually more interesting than anything that like the tool was making happen. But they're happy to let people see those old images of people with the God helmet on or wired into the Montauk chair or whatever it is. And as far as what you said about like, oh, this is available on somebody's dissertation, but where's what's on the documents that we can't see? Like, there's a couple of really weird things going on that are leading me to believe that either nothing is hidden. It's just that the things that people think are controversial aren't the real things that are controversial. So they put the real controversial things out there and busy everybody talking about the school shootings and COVID and whatever, that kind of shit, right? Or something happened recently as part of the clampdown on information. Like, are you familiar with the whole thing, like the dead internet theory?
No.
Okay, so the dead internet theory is basically the idea that the internet has become a Potemkin village, right? That a facade, but if you start going, like when you do a Google search, it'll say that there's 30 pages, but like on page 3, there starts being like, it's really nothing new. It's all the stuff that doesn't make sense, or there's no links. It really only goes to page 3. When I first started doing research, like I would go to 500, 600, 700 pages deep. What is available on the internet seems to have shrunk quite a bit. Wow. And a lot of the stuff that gets returned doesn't even seem to make sense unless you're really good at steganography, which I'm becoming reasonably good at. So some of it does make sense. But the things that are there, if you are looking at them with a specific eye, again, a little steganography, but also like not getting distracted by the noise, I actually am able to get better returns now than I did when the internet seems to have more stuff, although it's frustrating when you can't find something you used to be able to find or whatever it is. But there seems to be like an ability to get information that I had been looking for years now, but that wasn't available, but now it seems to be available. And then also there seems to have been like a very strange, like, I don't know if like a bunch of new documents got released at a certain point or what happened, but I have like someone connected through a family member who their biography in terms of the history of their work, which actually connects to some of the things you had in one of your thing about some of the cyclotron in Berkeley and that kind of stuff, that what his biography, including articles in the Los Angeles Times and other things, used to say was his work. Now it says something completely different, right? Oh. And something has changed because I had the argument with the family member about the nature of his work. And she says it was one thing, and that's what the documents online used to say. And now the documents online saying it's the thing that I was saying, and she was saying, right?
So it's coming out of the open, like something, right? But like, why is that, right? Why would they?
Why is that?
Right.
And I think that it's because a couple of things. I think that they understand, they love when people think that the things you're not allowed to talk about are the election being stolen or COVID or, you know, the gender
assassination.
Right? Well, because also if they censor you for talking about that, then they know that you'll waste at least another 10 hours talking about the fact that they censored you for. So you're again, not talking about anything, right? Meanwhile, people who have learned to cancel out the noise and are looking at the things that are really the topics that have since time immemorial been the controversial topics, just presenting themselves differently based on modernity and whatever it is, right? Those people are going to go look, and they're like you, like me, or whatever, are going to talk about the things that are really going on, and they need our ideas because they haven't solved the problem yet either. So it does this it performs like a dual service of like distracting,
filtering,
distractible to give you more time to get out ahead, because that's what they're interested in, is getting out ahead, right? And then getting people who are not easily distracted to work on the problem for you. Like in the OA, the young girl, Michelle, was like the guy who was running all of this high technology, like had questions he couldn't answer. And so she thought she was going to win a couple $100,000 in tokens for if she solved the game. And instead she got kidnapped and taken, you know, to this other thing where he wanted to use her for some other reason, which was the real point of the game. Who is smart enough to solve my problem? Right.
Exactly.
And so they want people talking about it. They want other people being like, I'm going to not stop watching your stuff so I can go over here and listen to so-and-so talk about the school shooting and whatever. And they'll say that, and we'll just focus in and whatever. So I think there is this sort of facade of something particular, like that world is one way, and then underneath it's sort of something different. But I think a lot of like what I was looking at in your slide deck, all of it made me have like other thoughts that answered questions that were still hanging out there for me about some of my thoughts, right? And with the gap junction stuff, it was like, okay, so is it possible that there was, because you talk about nanotechnology and sensors and all of this type of stuff, right? And is there some way that like this field that we're talking about is just tracked, like having something be in the body is able to track it, or can it be used to urge, to see if we can compel someone to do that gap junction thing and get them to find the drug dealer's house, like, right? Like,
In terms of steering.
Is it steering or is it recording? Right? Is it interested, or probably both, and maybe slightly different technologies for different things, right? But is it, you know, there's the either or, the both and whatever we're not thinking about. But it was really interesting to start to remember that, and particularly the part about the finding the drug dealers' houses, right?
Right.
Because if you have like thinking about the you do work on that, they're betting on someone's outcome.
Yeah.
In your case, it's like investment gambling, which their investments are gambles, because they want a specific outcome, and we can get into the really dark, sinister side of like how many of them are going to be betting on a bad outcome. And
exactly. That's
disgusting, right? But let's just say like you have,
and Austin is the center of all of that. Like Bloomberg. Yeah, totally. Let's you know, blockchain and QR code up all the homeless people in Austin and put them in the game, you know?
Yeah, right. But if the idea is, okay, we want to try and get her to go to the drug dealer's house or whatever it is, like, let's see if she does it. Let's see.
Yeah.
Like, but let's not even give her all the answers. Let's just make that the goal and see how I mean, there's a million ways.
That's like the slime mold. You know, when they're like, there's a maze, right? And then they use, you know, certain environmental conditions, and then they watch how it learns through the system.
Yeah.
So and I think that's the decision. Like, so much of the hedge funds are about, they want to eliminate bias, and then they want to focus on choice theory and decision making. And I think on the background, then they're using, you know, and this is a little more pedestrian, but like they're using our decision-making process to train the machines, because ultimately, if this machine consciousness wants to become somehow embodied in the real world, it needs to act on the human intelligence, which is our body interacting with sort of the quantum field, right? Yeah. I mean, and robots don't have a quantum field, like, because they're robots. So like all of that, it has to learn it in a very laborious way. So I think all of the decisions that are made along the way, and then they can poke and prod and create nudges or conditions that guide you in a certain direction. But then do you, of your own free will, because I think free will is a part of it too. Do you choose, like, will you choose to keep going?
Right. Yeah. I mean, you think about, like, you get this idea of like somebody sitting in a control room watching and wondering what the outcome is going to be, and like rooting you on or being upset because you're not doing the thing they bet on.
It's the Truman Show. Like, I mean, I did this, the flow life part of the series with my friend Brandy, focusing on Florida and looking at Seaside, which is where the Truman Show was filmed. But yeah, imagine instead of Ed Harris, like up in the lights, you know, looking down, that it's some AI thing, like, you know, the Purdue sentient world simulation or something, like rats, you know?
There's this idea of like the game. Some people call it the game. Some people refer to it in different ways as like the council, or like I've heard people call it the old ones or whatever. But a lot of people will talk about either seeing it or interacting with it when they're on meth. Right. And it's this basically like that there's people who are like outside of the normal field of reality, who are like looking at the people who are in the thing that we think of as reality, as like, it's like a game, and they're trying to steer them or get them to do certain things or whatever. And they're commenting on it. Right. And that when you're on meth, just kind of like I said, how they couldn't hide the technology, like there'd be some signature of it kind of there. Yeah. Right. When you're on meth, like sometimes you'll have a moment where you become aware that there seems to be like something behind the curtain, either controlling the game board or at least commenting on it, but you're never going to tell anybody because you're going to sound crazy. And so it's like a self, like, you know, like you're not going to be like, oh my God, today, like when I was at this place, I could hear people that I couldn't see talking about what was going on in the room, right? Kind of thing. Right. Like, it sounds crazy, but if you think about,
do you think that, I mean, I'm just thinking about like, I mean, not that all, you know, like unhoused people, a lot of them have, you know, different kinds of minds, whether you know, through addiction or, you know, non-conforming mental states to the consensus reality or what have you. And I'm increasingly feeling like within the concept of a game that some of these, especially the ongoing management of the creation of conditions that people can't afford housing and then are forced into sort of these aggregate communities, and then using these communities as sort of pop-up labs, labs for systems engineering, emergence, different things, but then feeling like maybe in conjunction with the addiction, aspect or, drug use part of it, that they could be almost like being used for their psychic, this ability to access aspects of the game that people who aren't in that state can't access. So that there's like a subset of the game that needs the certain kind of player who can get into those spaces.
Yeah, no, I mean that. So 100%, like this is like that they're serving the purpose of providing information to the system to expand their technology, right? And also there's another group of people who are profiting or doing something else with the management of these people. And everyone looking at it thinks it's about the management. No, they'll find a way to profit off of the thing that they're doing that will make it look like that's what this is. Meanwhile, it's exactly what you said, right? So, okay. So have you ever seen like a crazy person, right? Standing on the street corner somewhere, right? And they're saying all this stuff and you walk away, you're like, shit, well, that's the same shit I talk about on my channel, but like, they just don't understand the proper venue, right? It's that right kind of thing. So one of the things I noticed when I was on meth was it was like a peek into that sort of world where like, I looked at them and I was able to have that clarity of like, oh, okay, it's just like they're seeing, like I can see the outline of some of the things that they're clearly responding to. Right. And so like, I think that there's I don't know if there's just one or if there's like an endless number, like it's like the shit your cat sees, right? Something exists at a different frequency. And if you're resonating with that frequency, it's filled in for you. Right. Now, you've obviously heard about like the military takes amphetamines, Hitler took amphetamines and whatever. I think that in many ways, that's the frequency band that whatever it is we live in on a normal day-to-day basis is kind of puppeteered from, right? And then the people we call schizophrenic or bipolar or whatever, like they or just like some people who will be very psychic or very intuitive or whatever, like they may visit that occasionally or all the time, right?
Yeah.
And if they're crazy, nobody listens to them. If they're psychic or whatever, you can like, okay, well, they're like a hippy dippy crystal person and like it's nice, it's fun to make you feel better or not feel whatever it is. And then like people, when they're on drugs, it's like getting a snapshot of that. And obviously there's some crossover between things they call mental illness and drug addiction. And some people just use drugs casually and they might get a peak, but they'll just write it off to, I was on drugs. And it's the drug that the experience was the drug, as opposed to like whatever the drug, however that made like the water in my body vibrate or change something in my blood sugar or something, that it actually just allowed me to see something that is always there, but for some reason is like outside of my field of perception most of the time. Right. And so like, I don't know if it's like an entirely separate realm inhabited by other things and beings, or whether like the control system has like technologies or things. I don't know. I don't know. Like I don't spend
like even understanding the perception though, like our normal perception is a narrow band, right?
Yes.
Audio, visual, everything there's a much wider frequency that exists outside. And so, and that's, known by the military and all of them. I mean, they know that those fields of perception exist. And the more I look into it in terms of like the gamification and the group coordination, the social coordinations, that these are happening through this idea of like stigmergy, which is the social insects, the ants and the termites, and that their sensing mechanisms are chemical, right? Different patternings. And so I'm sort of, and you'll listen to the Web3 people talk, and a lot of times they'll say like, oh, we're going to give you superpowers, right? And even like within some of like the awakening crowd, this idea that our senses are going to be expanded into other areas. And so I feel like that's sort of where things are shifting, is that there are attempts to, through a variety of means, expand or add on to new ways of sensing. And even Levin talks about that. He's like, oh, well, you know, picture a future where you have an understanding of your liver function, like intuitively, like you just like, and you know, it's like, oh, we could like make that happen or whatever. But like that, your sense of like, you are aware of your liver and you know how it's doing, you know, on any given time, you can like dial that in. That's a different kind of sensing. And like, even within the OA, there are all of these aspects of water, and the scene with her with an octopus, and she's being transmitted information. And that's a different kind of sensing. Like the octopi have like a different sort of neural net sensing, like through the water, like as a communication medium. So I feel like in some ways that's part of what is coming. And then I think that the blockchain grid and the frequency and this idea of having a digital identity where we're hooked into smart meters, frequencies, individual communication devices is part of that push, like that stretching of the senses into things that might normally be considered more on a psychic level.
So this gets into some of the research that I've been doing about like quote unquote nuclear sites. And when I say nuclear sites, I don't mean just like 3 Mile Island or Chernobyl. I mean places where they're doing those kinds of places, but also any place where there's fusion reaction being worked on, or a particle accelerator or anything like that. So we're talking about Department of Energy locations. We're talking about Livermore Laboratory kinds of places. We're talking about Rocketdyne, Boeing, Raytheon, any places that are doing that kind of stuff, right? I think that these are locations that for people whose bodies, the genetics, for some reason, their body or something in their system has less electrical resistance, they seem to respond to these kinds of energy fields or locations. And remember, like there can be natural fusion as well. And natural, like some of these sacred sites are places where there seems to be what people would refer to as like a portal or a vortex or some sort of like natural energy field that is different. When certain people get into these places, their perception expands and they suddenly are able to have an extra senses of smell or feel, like the skin suit becomes like a technology. We're talking about the natural version. And I think as we move into living in a further radiated environment, and of course there's different kinds of radiation, and I think we have been sold a huge bill of goods in that we're all looking at radiation as one thing, and it's like not all the same. And human beings create radiation fields naturally. And I think you have one slide in there that was talking about how good of a human generator you were, right? Like what are you radiating? There's all kinds of things. But I think that some people under certain conditions, they express this further ability to perceive sensory information all around them. And as we move into having radiation in every little thing that Internet of Things, Internet of Body, they want to create that like an enclosed false kind of thing. So we want things in the body that will turn the skin into a suit that perceives things, but only the things we want perceived, not other stuff, right? So like it's very the biomimicry of everything, right? This is the one thing I wish people would get. Like this is the biggest inversion, and I wish people would get it. They're building their technology to mimic us. We are better than their technology, and they want us to believe that we are not as smart as the computers, that we need help to be able to operate at the same speed that the computer does, or whatever it is. And you know, when I mean, it's probably been longer than this, but when people started saying things like, when they started to describe their mind as being like a computer. No, a computer is like a mind, right? I got a download. It's like so people starting to try and make themselves more computer-like, even without the shit in the body or whatever it is, right? They want us to believe that we would be perfected if we became more like the technology. Meanwhile, if you listen to any of these people talk, all these conferences that you post, they are desperately trying to build technology that will do the same thing that our bodies do, but they want to be in control of it. Like,
Yes.
how can we mimic this, but create like a closed loop, like a closed system instead of an open system? Or how can we direct it like all one way or something like that, right? Can we make
well, a layer? I feel like, and that's part of the mirroring of the digital twinning, is that it's like they want to create a it's not a barrier like prevention, but like a layer. Like they want to coat everything in this so they can mirror every bit of what we have to offer into this, the creation of the mechanical system is what it feels like. Which is why I keep trying to like hit on the Web3. I feel like the Web3, not, you know, why it's such a shame that everyone's just so fixated on the central bank digital currency and they're just talking about it like it's that. I mean, that's like my hang up. I'm like, no, it's about an energetic signals communication network that's happening at all levels, like from and that's going to tap into our biological energy and our spiritual energy too. I mean, I feel like that is what that actually is that we're talking about, is the web. It's not just a money thing. It's not just a money and control thing. It's actually something that is a web, is a layer that's going to be put between us to like harvest us into the machine, like to feed the machine off of what we have to offer.
There was one, you had a couple of things in your slide. So I went through your whole.
I know it's a bit of a mess. I'm sorry. It's like
no, it's not.
Slides.
It's not a mess at all. Like there was some things that I opened a window that has a few tabs that were things I surely wanted to talk about with you, but there were other things that like didn't have a link that I could grab as easily. And you had a couple things about what you were talking about here, like the difference between. Oh, I know what it was. It was on the page. That was from this guy. Where is he? Omega Point. So the Desjardins, which I've heard of this person before, but I've never really looked into him. But I think he had some classification of a difference between tangential energy and spiritual energy.
Oh, I didn't see that before. Interesting. Yeah.
He called it radial energy.
Radial, yeah.
Right. And then you had something on your slideshow, I think, or something on some link I went to that was talking about how good of a human generator you were. And it was referring to the work of Robert Monroe, who I've gotten, like, I completely at this point think that I was lured to Austin the first time to sort of live out a gateway experience where they were tracking me as a human generator, right? To sort of see type of thing. And this may sound, I've said a million crazy things, so I don't really care if anybody thinks I'm crazy at this point. But I think that all the things that you're talking about, that they're trying to build this like vast network of, like, I, as a child, was in like the project from which these ideas came, right? Because everything I could, like I was telling you, when I was going through your slideshow, literally, I could tell you a story about almost everyone except for the ones that you were out here taking pictures of flowers and whatever, but all the science and all of the things you were showing, I'm like, oh yeah, well, that sounds like this thing that I've talked about, that it was like this weird experience I had that I didn't know. But all of these ideas of like, if you're going to build a game, you need to have something to have modeled it off of. And I don't know if when they were doing these projects and experiments the experiments, in my opinion, took a vast turn in the late 70s and into the early 80s, from something that had been much more about like trying to get to like force children or people into some specific behavior, move from that to like observing the behavior of specific people that you have found for some reason to be interesting, and then collecting information based on what you learn to see the direction that society, pop culture, groups of people, underground cultures are going to go, so you can use that to create your mimetic engineering, your genetic engineering, right? If they're very they're not different, right? So that then you can use that and you'll have had the information that you sort of gathered from some of these people. But like some of these games that
the projection, like doing the close study for a certain period of time and then letting it go out and see how it interacts at that point.
See how it interacts. And then like, I don't like, maybe it was just like, we're trying to see the way you know, we think society's going to go. And then they realized, okay, like it's going this way. That's interesting, but maybe we would like it to go a little bit more this way, or it's going to go all the way over here. We like that, but we want it to stop a few steps short of like where it ultimately
But that's
goes.
the morphogenesis. Like,
Yes.
I mean, to me, like that's what Levin talks about is the patterning. Like,
Yeah.
how do you build a hand and then know when to stop when the hand is done? You know,
Right.
it's this idea of using a social network. I mean, the social network is a neural. I mean, I'm not saying that happened like that. What you were talking about was a social network, but what we're living in now is digital information, largely communicated through social networking, and that in and of itself is an electrical field guiding growth in a certain direction.
I do think I was in some kind of network, right?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, I think a couple over time, but like the easiest one to quantify in terms of technologies that we see right now was like my involvement with underground dance music and the rave scene, and what has sort of happened with that scene in general, but just in terms of some of the amount of information that was collected with people on certain substances, listening to certain frequencies in certain locations with certain like kinds of, I mean, I can see the way that that's all played out in terms of like things that are being pushed now and whatnot. And also just like the people, like there's some phenomenally weird and interesting people in those scenes. And then like, you know, what happens to them, but this whole sort of like somebody else always becomes famous for like a sound or an idea or something that someone else originated, or something that someone thought was cool. By the time it reaches the world, that person is like, they have distorted what I thought was cool, and this is not what I'm doing anymore, but nobody really even knows about that person, right?
Right.
It's such a great place to do. It's like a petri dish, and everyone's on drugs, so there's plausible deniability for everything.
Yeah.
Right. So there's plausible deniability, and then, you know, some other things as well. I wanted to make sure we talk a little bit about like that, some of the stuff related to the blood sugar issue.
Yeah.
Sent me a lot of stuff about that. It's something I've been monitoring for obviously a long time in different ways.
Yeah.
But do you like, you know, you kind of were tracking that independently. Like, can you tell, can you
Well, sometimes you come across things and you're like, there's something to this, but I don't have enough context around it to know what it means yet. And so early on, like part of my system is I make these big maps, right? And they're not really beautiful to look at, but essentially the way I do these maps, it's like they sort of tell stories or like sub stories within them. So I used to use this software, Little Sis, but then I realized it's fascinating from complexity because, you know, and now I'm in a different software, but they're all honeypots because like, and I, you know, I was just a regular person. I didn't, you know, I was clueless, right? But they would set up these research portals, but then you don't stop to think until they delete all 300 of your maps that they were looking from the backside to see exactly what you were looking at, right? And so in a way, when you were talking about crowdsourcing and doing the work for you, like, I don't know how much of the work I was doing in my mapping of laying this out, but I got to a certain point and it was intolerable for them. So they just disappeared it. But one of these early maps, and it was funded by Open Society, right? Like I shouldn't have like, you know, it's like Ziggy at the Public School of Medicine at Columbia University, which, you know, where so much of the Manhattan Project comes out, you know, like, come on. Yeah. So live and learn, like you have to have those experiences to come out the other side and be like, okay, yeah, now I know what that is. But one of the ones I was doing early on in, the lockdown, like the first year, it was around social impact bonds, which was really has been my focus, these financial instruments, not really bonds, but a way of getting surveillance data, cybernetics. And the first health impact bond backed by social finance, Ronald Cohen is the guy. He's in England, but he has ties to Israel. They were working with Sweden, and they were working on one for diabetes, and like Novartis was part of this. And they were developing smart shirts, like smart clothing for diabetes management, and that was with Stanford. So it was this huge international project around diabetes management for impact finance. And I was like, I know that diabetes can also result from like, I've read papers like dirty electric. Like you can have frequency stuff that will
that's the same as Lilly waves. That's the Lilly waves.
Okay, yeah. So so if they're going to bathe us all in radiation, they need some sort of like diabetic management. And then more recently, looking at Esther Dyson, who's the daughter of Friedman Dyson, who is the Dyson Sphere space colonization guy. She's saying she's been running a program for 10 years of wellness in like 5 mid-sized towns. And this is all part of this, again, cybernetic management for impact data for machine learning and impact finance, but something else. There's something else about that. So there's an interview with Esther, who is a Russophile. She's on the board of Yandex, which is like the Google of Russia. She trained to be a cosmonaut. And of course, all of the Soviet Union, like we were busy doing the mind control programs. The Soviets were even deeper into the parapsychology stuff. Mm-hmm. So Esther's all, like this with, Russia. And she says, well, I wear a continuous glucose monitor all the time. And she's like a skinny little bird. She's like, I'm not diabetic. I think we should all wear one. And by the way, I use 5 sleep monitoring devices. And she's the one running these wellness programs. So, I'm seeing these things pieced together around the diabetes, the glucose. Then in Synchronistically, someone sends me an article the same week that they've developed, I think it was maybe last year, a fuel cell, literally a fuel cell that runs on excess glucose in the blood. And so guess what? Like to power your diabetes, your insulin pump, you can do it yourself, like with this implantable glucose fuel cell, and also to run all of your, artificial organs that they're going to give you after Michael Levin figures out his organ, visualizing machine. So there were, and then even in that, the walk in the churchyard, the Dallas family that I saw initially, they were Scottish. They owned plantations in Jamaica, and they were sugar plantations. And so there's this whole thing of, slavery, the Scots, the Scottish is also the Freemasonry aspect, and the sugar and the control system. And then literally you've got people developing glucose monitor and smart shirts to steer people around. And then I'm trying to remember all of the other stuff with glucose, but there was some stuff with, you've talked about before about crystalline, right? And information conveyance and all of that. So it feels like if you were going to do remote monitoring, that might be a way to do that.
So a couple of things. You said a bunch of interesting stuff there, and I do want to get to the Scottish Jamaican thing in just a second, because it's kind of interesting, well, very interesting. But I did open a couple of things based on this sugar topic. So this is the reason I asked you about if you were familiar with Lilly waves or John Lilly, right? But some of his work was about like frequency and brain entrainment and brain patterns and all of that kind of stuff, and tracking electromagnetism. Okay. But here it's talking about like I'm just going to read a little bit so you have the context. There is, however, a far more advanced form and largely unknown and suppressed purpose in the use of the Lilly wave. The water molecules within the brain can be made to resonate at a desired frequency. This causes the electrons that comprise the brain's electrical voltages to also resonate at that same frequency. It is not a requirement, as is understood by the majority of science, to implant electrodes, so just like what we were talking about earlier, into the brain as the water molecules to be entrained to a certain frequency. It can also be accomplished by any waveform that can penetrate the skull and then cause the entrainment of the brain's water molecules. For example, radio waves emitted at a frequency of 40 hertz targeted at a person's brain will entrain the water molecules to a degree of 40 hertz, and thus the rest of the brain's electrons will also resonate at that frequency, which makes you wonder about some of the people that they quote say are mentally ill or not, or whatnot, whatever. Right. In this manner, it is possible, and also about what's the frequency of some of these drugs. Like I have a frequency generator, and one time I did research on what the frequency of meth was. I turned the generator to that number, and I instantly felt like what my body had felt like when I was on meth. So you can produce these states with frequency. It is in this manner possible to stimulate and control brainwave patterns remotely with the electromagnetism and also acoustic waves. However, it is imperative to understand that if the wave is not biphasic, it will result in damage to the brain's neurons and cause what is termed brain damage. It is not the case that only the brain's water molecules can be entrained. It is also true of the blood sugar. Iron within the cellular structure composing the neurons of the brain and various other elements can also be entrained to resonate at a desired frequency. Possibly the reason for the attack on tobacco. Nicotine is a blood sugar regulator. If a molecule—
Can I just say one thing really quick about the iron? So when I was doing my research into conditional cash transfer in Mexico, so Mexico in the mid 1990s was the test bed for early digital currency. Now, it wasn't digital at the time, but they were targeting low income women in the south of Mexico and their children for various desirable behaviors about school attendance or healthcare visits or various things. And part of the program, which was all sort of run out of people connected to like Boston University and Yale, and it was in Mexico, but it was not of Mexico per se. The children were given iron supplements.
Mm-hmm.
And literally in the paper, the write-up later, and there were people connected with Penn and Stanford, like a lot of high-level social scientists doing the research. And they said, oh, by the way, we didn't really find anything a benefit of the iron supplement, but it turns out it was the wrong kind. But, it helped them. They liked it and it wasn't hurting. And it just helped them, it helped us run the program. So we just did it anyway. And so I'm like, what was in those supplements that they were giving those Mexican children? And the thing is, it's the south of Mexico too. So that's like the Zapatistas, that's like the Maya, that's, really, I mean, it's interesting in terms of the shamanic aspects, like what were they giving those kids? And so when I see stuff about resonating iron in the cellular structure.
Yep. Yeah. Okay. So I just want to continue a little bit because of the sugar. If a molecule is targeted by a wave that resonates at the same frequency as that molecule will explode. Sugar is a crystal, and crystals, when stressed, broken, or you remember some of the things I was talking about the sugar crystals in the series. Yeah. When stressed, broken, or deformed, release an electric and electromagnetic charge. This is known as triboluminescence. I'm going to look up what triboluminescence means. I know what bioluminescence is, but I don't know what triboluminescence is. Let's see what triboluminescence is. Refers to the phenomenon that materials could be light when they are mechanically stimulated, such as rubbing, grinding, impact, stretching, and compression. Okay, so
Francis Bacon. That's interesting.
It's always Francis Bacon, right? Shout out to you, Michael. It's always Francis Bacon. The effect of an exploding sugar crystal is quite damaging to the mind and brain. It creates extreme confusion, dizziness, and also a state best described as lack of awareness or apathy. The Lilly wave frequency is a secret military application. It is known as the madness frequency. The Los Angeles riots are said to have been the first open test of its capacity to mass control anger and violent response from the mob. And here's more about the iron down here. I didn't keep going this morning when I was reading over this. Further, I went looking back through my files to find this sheet. Yeah. Furthermore, there are other profound effects of entraining the brain and blood's iron molecules, one of which is to cause the iron to condense together via resonant attraction and clump within the brain. This has the effect of causing the iron to be magnetized and rush to the top of your head, resulting in a rush of blood to the head and extreme confusion and dizziness. It can also be reversed, which causes a draining of blood from the head, leading to out unconsciousness. Okay, so a couple of things about this. So sugar was a main part of like my sort of programming and lots of other, I was not allowed to eat sugar as a child. So then when I would be somewhere there was sugar, like I really wanted it. And then when my parents separated, like I could have sugar at my mom's house, but not at my dad's house. And when I became 16, it was like a license to buy sugar more than drive or whatever it was, right? But it was highly wrapped into anomalous experiences that I had. Like you heard me say in those videos, like I would wake up in the morning, gummy bears in my hair and all this kind of stuff. But a lot of these occurrences had periods of like confusion or missing time or something like that. When I'm looking at what the thing you sent me about the Santa Fe Institute, maybe we'll get to that in just a few minutes, because I think it's interesting and I think I can add to that. Like it does create a sense of confusion or lack of memory as to what has sort of gone on. I used to watch Inspector Gadget when I was little, and it would be like, this message will self-destruct in 30 seconds or whatever, right? If sugar is being used for entrainment or programming, and then like it's like a frequency being targeted at a crystal to extract something, whether it be energy or information, And then as soon as that explodes, it's like it didn't happen. It's like the message
Snapchat of the, yeah.
Right. Like, I mean, like I think that that's sort of how it kind of goes, right?
But I mean, to what you were saying, like, we're better than the computers. Like, we're information carrying and communicating devices in our own biology at a level that's probably much higher than the computers themselves. Yeah.
Much higher. So with the blood sugar thing, like, you know, one of the, when they're describing how people feel, like, and they said that they used it during the riots, or people feel apathy or lack of awareness. Like, that's how people who say they have like a frequency sensitivity, they claim to feel when they're near like 5G towers, or where they're in an area where there's like a lot of Wi-Fi or something like that, right? So one of the documents that I looked at that you sent was something about 5th generation warfare, right? And then we also have the issue of 5G. I don't know. I'm just going to let you take a wild guess. What is the resting blood sugar in the body when it has not been stimulated by anything?
I don't know.
5 grams.
Oh, really?
Right. So basically, like, if you like, you know, anytime you eat something, like, it's just about 5 grams or just under that. So if, to the extent that there's, I mean, I don't really know what to think of all the 5G stuff. Like, there's a lot of things around there, right? But if you combine that with a diet increased in sugar, right? In fact, like, things that don't even taste sweet somehow have 30 grams of sugar in it, and whatever it is, then I think that, like, diet becomes a way to this is what I talked about this. I don't know if I talked about it in the series, but I brought it up with someone who's very fixated on the 5G thing and whatnot. And I suggested that, like, a way to avoid the ill effects of 5G was to not eat sugar. And they thought that was an interesting idea, but then I never heard back from them because, right? I never heard back from them again after that.
I would say too, like, on the diet, if I put like my school education activist hat on, I mean, and, you know, and again, I come at things from more of a progressive side, but, you know, acknowledging that that's not a helpful construct anymore, but just like the stereotype. So, like, the conservatives like have concerns about the school system often, but it is accurate. What I've seen is that there is an overreach in terms of controlling the lives of children, to have before school all the way to some extended day after school, year-round school. And within that, like, the food offering, like, often the justification for that is hungry children, which I'm not denying the fact that there are hungry children. But when I started doing research early on into, well, like, who is providing the food for the schools? And there are these large, you know, multinational food processing companies, and especially like in the aftercare. And in Philadelphia, most of our, you know, we have very old school buildings, a lot of, like, you know, where my kid was in elementary school, it was built during the days where you would go home for lunch. So there was no kitchen. I mean, there was a room that they called the cafeteria, but there's no cooking kitchen. So everything was reheated, and it was the worst possible food. And then even the fresh stuff would be like, you know, a sad apple or something, like, and so the kids, it wasn't appealing to the kids at all. But if you imagine containing the kids in these environments, especially, you know, low income kids and Black and brown kids, because I keep saying that, like, the melanin is a huge focus of this, the stuff of the photonic and optical computing. And so, like, you know, you've got these literally captive children in the schools, and you're feeding them a bunch of like high processed sugary stuff, you know, in the name of wellness and health and equity. Like, it gets really messed up, and it's hard to have that conversation, because on the one hand, like, no, you don't want children to be hungry, but on the other hand, who's actually deciding what the food is that they're going to be getting?
If you look, there was like a list that came out, and I wouldn't know how to term it to pull it up because it's hilarious, right? But the list of like the 30 most nutritious foods for you, and like Frosted Flakes is on there. Like, Frosted Flakes is like number 3, but like meat, like beef, is like number 30 or something like that, right? There is a tendency in the programs that you're talking about, but now just in this general diet push and things like that, to really, like, they want people to eat sugar, but even with the things that are more healthy, it's always very carbohydrate centric, which is your body is going to process that as sugar, even if it's like something that theoretically is good for you and may provide some energy for something later. It's going to allow that buildup of sugar in the body for a period of time to create whatever that. I mean, it would be interesting to know how much electricity is generated by the explosion of those sugar molecules, right?
Yeah.
And sort of like, where does that go? But
it's to your fuel cell glucose monitor, your excess blood glucose. Like they're literally building fuel cells for it.
Well, I think I pulled here. You showed this thing, right? Like you showed this implantable fuel cell, right?
That's what someone sent
these
me.
right here look like. I mean, I haven't pulled anything that looks like this out of my body, but I've pulled this out of my body before. Wires that look exactly like that, right? And they say it's a cell that generates electricity. So, like, where's that generate? If you don't have a device that you're trying to power with that, where is that going? Like, what else? Right? Kind of thing. So, we live in a completely electrified environment that we think everything that's there is like generating something, but what if some of it is collecting stuff? Right. So that type of thing. What was I going to say with so you have a lot of people who have figured out, the system definitely doesn't like from one perspective, the system does not like people leaning towards like a carnivore or a keto diet, right? From another perspective, there's like a part of them that likes it. And now there's this push for putting the mRNA into the cow. So then all the people who stopped eating sugar but are eating steak all the time, right? So there's not like, I don't think there's like particularly like a one size fits all way to escape this. But when you see there being a centralized push for less meat consumption, and I say this as a person who I was a vegetarian for 15 years, right? And it was moral things and also some skewed diet, like weight and diet ideas that we were, fed heavily in the 90s and whatever. Yeah. But I too, like you, I come from a more progressive background. Everyone in my family is of the left. When I was still a voting person, I've never voted for a Republican in my life. I see the issues on both sides because I've obviously been in the sort of conspiracy community for a really long time, which is populated by more people who come from maybe a more conservative background, at least at this point. Like there was a time when there was more sort of people of the left in it. Maybe there will be sort of, again, I don't know, but I can see the issues on all the sides. Yeah. But I was a vegetarian for 15 years and, eventually was not a vegetarian anymore. And at this point, eat mostly an animal-based diet, for a variety of reasons. But it's difficult, like for, people have really been brainwashed into thinking that, things from the carbohydrate realm of things are good for them. And maybe if we lived in a kind world, they would be. But as long as there's this system,
zapping
frequency
crystal zapping,
right? Like sometimes eating something that like, I can understand why people think, well, maybe eating all that meat isn't necessarily good for you. Maybe we're living in a world of like the thing that at this time is the least bad for you, right? Is the way to go. It's almost just like closing off your receptors to certain things out there. So, so there's that. I looked at that. There was also, there was one other thing about it's in terms of the implants. Like I watch a lot of tennis. I'm obsessed with tennis. And they are constantly advertising on the tennis channel for the diabetes thing.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
I forget I have a podcast called the Occult Tennis Podcast, and we covered it in that one time. Like that, you have them, every commercial is for the diabetes thing. And then the women's tennis tour is sponsored by Hologic, which is monitoring everything going on in your body all the time. All the WTA players have been exposed to it. But what you were saying about the clothing, right? Like you would be shocked if you saw the level to which tennis is analyzed, and the tennis court has like the Internet of Things operating all around it. There's this IBM commercial. Let me see if I can show you. I think you'll find this fascinating. IBM tennis commercial. All right. Let's see if I can find the one that
I hadn't really thought that much about all of the sports in the quantified self. I don't know so much with the tennis because unless it's doubles, but this idea of teaming and coordination, is really, I was just talking to my husband who watches a lot of baseball, and he's like, oh yeah, there's all these changes underway for baseball because with all of the big AI data, something about moving the outfield, like they would know for every player which side to move the outfielders in, and essentially like everything just became an out. So there was like nothing interesting. It was like the game became not interesting anymore because the predictive analytics were so good that it was just like a big
It's
nothing.
called the shift. They do what's called the shift, where all of the outfielders move. Like,
and I guess they stopped that this year but they were using all the AI, so they would just know. And he even said like I guess there's headsets now between the pitcher and the catcher so that they don't do the signaling. He's like, it's really a sad thing because now they just talk to each other on the headset.
During COVID, they took away like the line callers in tennis. So it's just like Hawkeye on everything now, which like on some level, you could make the argument that it's more fair because it's not, but on the other level, it's like it takes the tradition and the history out of it. Check out this commercial. I want you to see this. And then I have something to add to it. Right. So. Oh, is there no?
Wimbledon is a traditional championships, but there's so much technology hidden behind the scenes. There are around 120 broadcast cameras around Wimbledon's grounds, broadcasting to a global audience of around 1 billion. The movement of the players and the ball is tracked around the court by 10 different cameras, tracking 50 frames a second. There's the sensors in the roof that track the humidity, the sensor on the net cord, the LED displays showing the score, and the speed of serve. There's the data entry system capturing stats from all the matches. There are 110 miles of television cable running around the grounds. But we hide as much of the technology as we can. It's about being able to stay true to our original ideal, tennis in an English garden.
We're in the garden. We're
right.
In the garden.
I mean, on some level, like you go to Wimbledon, you still have to wear white. It's very formal. They have strict rules about what time play starts and what time play stops and all of this kind of stuff. But there's all of this sort of behind the scenes that people, I mean, I have a lot of wild ideas about tennis, but one of the things when you're talking about this clothing, I noticed a few years back that the materials, the tennis clothing started to really change, both in terms of the material, but also like the design. There was this particular year where like everything went to this like vapor like look where everything looked misty. Right. And then there was another one that had like this weird, all the Nike stuff, but even some other brands had like this weird, almost like tracking of the spinal column down the back of the shirt. Right.
Like visually people, or like a stripe?
Some people it was just a straight line, but it's a different material, the line. And then on other people, it was like segmented, almost like vertebra, right? Like on certain, like
so it's like for artificial vision or something?
No, theoretically, it just is like a design concept. But if we're talking about materials that have certain fibers, there's this interesting material that all the clothes are now. It's like not cotton or regular nylon, like what you and I would think of if we were going to, right? It's this weird sort of, I don't know. I guess I could look and see what it is, right?
Probably built out of like spider yeast bioreactors or something like that.
Something like that, right? But like there, I'm wondering if this is part of the tracking the movement of the player around the court, right? Type of thing as well. There seems to be, how, like with chess games, they keep track of the moves, right? Or like the football teams, they have like their notebook where they have the different plays, and it's like a geometric pattern that they've put out that the coordinator has done. Okay, we're going to do this play now. Like, I think that it's like tracking all of that data for the match, almost like the way they track the moves in a chess game, that somehow these like geometric patterns kind of, you were talking about the polyhedra moving around in terms of someone's, interaction with
digital twinning.
Right? Like, I feel like tennis is the perfect physical representation of like the sacred geometry of space, time, and sound. And you've got like elements of chess, but you've also got the athletics, and there's the battle of the will and all of this kind of stuff. It's like, it's not the royal.
There's like psychology in tennis. Like, is there a part of it
very
psychological? Because I think that's what they're after.
I mean, 100%, right? There's tactics in terms of how you deploy your game, but there's also intimidation tactics. There's wearing your opponent down, and that opponent wear down can come through physical stuff or mind games, psychology type of thing. I mean, in a Grand Slam match, by the time you get to the later stages, but even sometimes early stages, sometimes they're out there for 5 or 6 hours, right? And the amount of different styles of gameplay that you use during those 5 hours, right? You know, and some of these people have rivalries that have been going on 15 or 20 years now, right? Like this is like high warfare.
You wonder about who gets that data too.
I know who gets that data, right? So I don't know, like, so I have theory, right? So like, I have a theory of the big 4 in tennis. Like there's the big 3 that it's Roger Federer, Rafael Nadal, and Novak Djokovic, right? And then there was also Andy Murray, who he was with, he had a lot of injuries, but each of them had like an extensive relationship on some level, very well known or less known, with one of our big 4 tech magnates. So Roger Federer and Bill Gates do a lot of work together. And one of my huge criticisms of Roger, like people love Roger Federer. He's like the fucking Dalai Lama or something. You can't say anything about him, but no one will ever address his very disturbing relationship with Bill Gates, which he obviously has one. They've done a lot of things together. And it's like, well, wait a second. Like, even if you're a person who like believes nonsensical things, like nobody can really think that like Bill Gates is in it just for helping people at this point. So the question could at least be asked. Rafael Nadal, one of his best friends is Larry Ellison from Oracle.
Oh, wow.
Fascinating company that doesn't get the attention it should. Yeah. Everyone's
the interoperable database.
Bill Gates and all that kind of stuff. Andy Murray has like commented on and done things a little bit more behind the scenes with Jeff Bezos, right? And Novak Djokovic has this interesting, he sits on the board of the Tesla Foundation with Elon Musk, right? And if you were going to go, okay, you want to pair, Novak Djokovic is kind of like the Elon Musk of the tennis world on some level. Like he's despised by the establishment, but sometimes it's hard to tell what his true motivation for things are. It's I'm not as suspicious of Novak Djokovic as I am of Elon Musk, right? But I had this model for the other 3, and I'm like, if I were going to pick someone that Novak Djokovic was like, I bet it'd be Elon Musk. So I went and looked if there was any connection between the 2 of them. And the way I found it was that they were sitting next to each other on the board, right? Like on the webpage, right? Kind of thing. And then if you go and you look at, Novak Djokovic actually looks quite a bit like Nikola Tesla. In fact, somebody has like done the morphology of their faces. And so like I have a synchronistic thread about Novak Djokovic being the reincarnation of Nikola Tesla and whatnot. And it's fun to sort of play with it. But like, theoretically, in some ways, Tesla was sort of disdained by the establishment in the same way Novak Djokovic is in tennis, because he kind of goes the other way from the in crowd or whatever it is, right? But so they're tracking all this data for sure. And I actually think like in some ways, like the tennis is like a little mock-up or a diorama of things that will happen on the world stage later, because I've used tennis a lot to predict what's coming. And I think you can do this with other sports or other, like some people say like the UFC, they do that with the UFC or whatever it is. But I think for the kids, I think the soccer is, because Peter Stone at UT Austin has been working on that RoboCup with Sony for years, for like 20 years. RoboCup?
Yeah, RoboCup. It's a robot soccer team.
Okay.
And so, and he's the head of Sony AI in North America. And so they've been developing more and more sophisticated robots to work on teaming. Right. And it's not just because they want to, play, because they like soccer and they think that's good. I think that there's something also global. It's minimal equipment, right? It's something that actually works well for, poor kids, right? In refugee camps, like they make balls out of whatever. Like, and so imagine, like you were talking about, smart wear for, elite tennis athletes, but imagine that all of a sudden some humanitarian aid program starts to develop like smart, pickup teams, right, for soccer in the favelas or the refugee camps or what have you, and then sets the kids up with some jerseys, these smart jerseys. What concerns me, especially about the children, is this idea of like Sep Kamvar in the Montessori Wildflower Montessori pre-Ks, that they were putting sensors in the children's shoes and then tracking them throughout the pre-K. But imagine the equivalency of a sensor network with millions upon millions of children around the world playing pickup soccer, teaming in informal environments. Like, those are vast data sets on collaboration and strategy and decision theory. So for me, that's something that I've really been interested in, especially because Stone is there in Austin, because tennis has a certain mystique, about the elitism, but I would say soccer is probably the inversion of that in terms of the global, not just working class, but like it's equally accessible to all kinds of people is soccer. And it has this collective component of the teaming and the interplay among I'm not trying to say this, but there are more permutations because there are more team players in terms of the back and forth.
Have you heard of pickleball? Pickleball is like the democratization of tennis for everybody. It's
I just recently heard about that. I guess Mark Andreessen was talking about everybody's about pickleball.
Of course, right?
Yeah. He's like all of the Silicon Valley places have to turn their tennis courts into pickleball courts or something.
Yeah, right. So it's a similar idea to the sort of RoboCup thing. I think the other thing is like, okay, so there's the tracking going on, but that's a lot of like energy being generated that is being collected, right?
Yeah.
Like if you like, this is the whole, like years ago, like Sophia and I started down this path of like, 'cause her whole work on the piezoelectric system and the body and whatnot. And in that, basically, there was the whole thing where like, there was going to be like some sort of cryptocurrency where you could exercise and earn the cryptocurrency and all of this kind of stuff. And so I think there's a desire to collect the energy that people generate by movement, right? Even like swiping. She said that there's something that collects energy every time like you swipe on something with your finger or whatever.
Yeah, the piezo stuff is really ubiquitous, I think.
Right. And so like, and imagine like you also can figure out pretty quickly, like who generates the most amount of energy by the fact that they're hyper. And Sophia, I'm with a lot of extra energy compared to most people, was proposing that I could probably power their whole alternate universe while they were building the whatever. But from exercising or dancing, or if somebody's body just naturally radiates more electricity, right?
Yeah.
Kind of thing. Now all of this, like a lot of these ideas, like I love the idea of like, I exercise a lot. If I could like use my exercise to charge the battery that I could run my house with so I didn't have to pay the utility company, that sounds great, but it's never a sovereign use of these things. It's always a digital interface, right?
It's the 50 million merits or 15 million merits, the Black Mirror. I don't know if you saw, that episode.
I haven't seen Black Mirror, but I'm familiar with these kinds of
like you have to like they're the exercisers and and then they have to be fed media. Like the exercise bike is looking at a screen, it's programming you as you do the exercise, and you earn your merits by how much cycling.
Yeah. Real quickly, I just had the thought and I wanted to go back to it before I forget. And then I want to say something about what you said about the Jamaica and the Scots and whatnot. You had said something before about the unhoused people, right?
Yeah.
And were they, sort of tracking and monitoring, and was it really like accessing some of their giftings and things like that? Obviously, with a lot of those people, there's also like, if they're going to food banks or they're just eating whatever they can, their blood sugar is high, right? So there's some of that going on. And we're like, even if it's just like energy collection, like using them as batteries, and then there's sort of a, with all those LED lights that are there, like that might be a frequency that causes that blood sugar molecule explosion. Like we're noticing that all the homeless encampments or places where they allow those people to congregate, whether they're
lighting,
homeless shelter or not, I think it's possible that it's doing that. But I think also that's the kind of light that like, it's like almost like a thermal radar where you can see sort of like what somebody's energy.
It's interesting because this other piece that I'm working on about, it's looking at Spokane, Washington and the opportunity zones and insurance company wellness programs, and they have a large homeless encampment there. So, and the woman I was talking with is saying like, it's become, you know, a challenge because it's not resolving, like it's not providing people affordable housing. It's just managing them in place with these NGOs. But it was set up in the transportation corridors of the highway.
Right.
Like during the lockdown, Inslee, the governor, introduced legislation to manage homeless encampments in the highway corridors of Washington state, which is kind of an odd, like, I mean, you could say, well, it's public property and there's this extra space, but also from what you're saying about the lighting, if it's in an urban area, oftentimes it is the highway, the public infrastructure lights that have this kind of special, like they're up, get the lighting upgrades. So like, are they irradiating people along the highways?
So a client of mine showed me a video. There's like a live stream set up, camera pointed at a specific highway overpass, like what you're talking, like that corridor that you're talking about, that they started keeping a live stream going there because like weird shit happens there and like people will appear out of nowhere. When I say out of nowhere, I don't mean like somebody just wandered. I know, I mean like they weren't there and then they were there, right? Like somebody was filming that. And apparently there's been lots of activity caught on this, that it seems to be like a crossover of realities or whatever, right? So my guess would be that is like literally they're putting those encampments there because that's where there seems to be this crossing of reality. Well, I think they're wanting to see what happens. I think there's an investment in sort of like tracking people throughout their travels. And maybe it's like, maybe it shows up on a map where they can see like this person has wandered off the map of this frequency, which is like this band, and then they're here. Or maybe they can't track it that way, but if they've been into another frequency and come back, then those lights show like a stain on them. Like if they go into like another frequency band, when they come back, they look like they've been irradiated or something like that, right? But there's a constant, always going webcam over this one highway overpass in I'll ask her again. She showed it to me one time. I'll ask her. There's also, I don't know if you ever saw this. It's a terrible movie. It's on Prime. It's like, it's one of the worst movies I've ever seen. So if you decide to watch it for the reason I'm telling you, I'm apologizing in advance. It's called Bliss, and it has Owen Wilson and Salma Hayek. And it's like, I don't know how they got people that famous to do a movie this stupid, but they were basically hanging out under freeway overpasses in, to me, what looked like Los Angeles. But I think part of the magic of the movie, the magic, was to make people think it's whatever city that they've spent the most time in or something like that, right? And that there were certain people that like had kind of a flash or a glimmer, and there was, Salma Hayek could like recognize these people, but basically she would, a lot of people were hanging out under this freeway overpass, and they were doing this drug that like it was like these weird little diamonds, and they had this machine to shoot it up their nose. And then they were like going to another reality that was like right there, where like they weren't homeless people living under the freeway, but they were like geniuses conducting interdimensional mind control experiments in like a high-tech laboratory and living a fancy life, right? So like these ideas don't come from nowhere.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And
well, I think like the multiverse aspect, the fact that like Everything Everywhere All at Once won the Oscar, and it's weird because during the lockdowns and my husband and I are on sort of different understandings about what had happened. So we try to occasionally find like,
I like that you put that. I like it.
Good. And so like during the past year, like we'd occasionally go see movies, and we saw both Don't Worry, Darling, and then Everything All at Once. And he was like, I can't believe that won the Oscar. I'm like, that's because multiverse is the thing, honey. They wanted to win the Oscar. Like it's an imprinting, which is again, back to the OA and this Garden of Forking Paths and the alternate dimensionality. Like it's going to become normalized. And especially like NVIDIA, they're saying, they're omniverse. Oh, we've already built it. You can explore alternate futurities, it's like a time machine. They're already dropping that stuff in the public consciousness.
Well, 100%. Like, I think that they want people to feel like the exploration of, they're going to do augmented reality, and people are going to think that they experienced a different version of reality. Yeah. But within that, also whether there is some sort of energetic thing happening that is thinning the veils between reality and there is some real version of that going on, or whether there's always been sort of open zones, but certain people are becoming more refined in their ability to find them or perceive them. And so that's going to be at play. Like, I think this is there's a confluence of like a lot of things happening here, which I also think is part of why the introduction of microdosing right now is so popular, to blur those lines. And then, what's interesting is, like, here in Austin, like you had a series of videos last year where you went to a bunch of different spots around town. And it's funny, like you told like a similar story about one particular thing that I told about Laura, about that place when we were driving by one day. There was like a place that looked like it had just like been run over with like graffiti. It was like a bombed out building that had all this and all this kind of stuff. And I was like, I had told her when we drove by there one time that this is the perfect scaffolding for like augmented reality. Like, kids are going to come here with their like video game or on their microdose, and they're going to think that they're hanging out in some like futuristic intergalactic art gallery or some shit like that. And then you're literally standing there like saying the same thing about it, right? But I think the augmenting of reality is already going on here. And I think it's been going on for a long time, but I think it was highly classified or very limited before. And now it's a little bit more out in the open because they're just checking to see if anybody notices. But like, one of the things that when I first lived here in 1999, all of the raves were at the Austin City Music Hall downtown, which is now the building that Elon Musk lives in. So, right, it's right against Shoal Creek, and there's a lot of limestone there. And actually, limestone came up in one of the links, I think in the Anasazi, something about the Anasazi that I looked up based on your aunt Anasazi. I wanted to talk about that Santa Fe Institute thing in a minute. But there's a ton of limestone. There's a power plant, and then it goes out onto the river. And I think it's like I call that the blast zone, right? Like, I think there is some kind of connective, some portal or something is open there, and maybe more open at specific times or whatever it is. But it has to do with the power plant, and all of the people who are in the know have built their homes and their businesses around that because they want to be right there for the big show or whatever it is, right? But I'd go to parties there, and I might take acid or ecstasy or mushrooms or whatever. But when I would be driving home or coming home in the morning at like 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning, when it was like in that space between light and dark, and I wasn't like real fucked up anymore, but still a little bit, like I could see little things that weren't there yet, but are there now. Right? Like, I could see the outlines of buildings that were not there then, but now the city looks exactly like the visions that I used to have. Right. Wow. And so party scene people, rave scene people, or just people who had been in a project when they were a kid, that's great to experiment with them on that kind of stuff. Right. But I would see the city almost as like, and it's funny because I talk about this now. I talk about interdimensional architecture and musical buildings. Like, I saw the whole structure of downtown is like part of the party. Some of the buildings would look like they were the turntables, and they had the cranes there that were building things, and it looked like the needle on the record player and whatever. But I would like tell these things to my friends and make like ridiculous commentary about them. But like, that's what it looks like now. Like the things I used to say at like 11 o'clock Monday morning when we were still up and I was just like going on about nonsense, like are there now. And when I'm out here, like it doesn't look the same every day. And like, I noticed some pretty strange things with like people, like, and the way they move and things that they're doing. And like, some days it's not like that. And other days it's like that. And when it's like that, it's involving a lot of different like people, right? For a while, when I first got here, there were all these people that would come onto the trail that like almost looked not fully consciously aware. They'd be walking and they had tattoos all over their body, but they weren't like a sleeve or a mural like you would normally think. They were just all weird single individual tattoos, right? And I don't know if you ever saw the movie Memento. Did you ever see the movie Memento?
I don't think so.
The guy's memory would reset every 21 minutes. And so he had everything that he needed to remember tattooed on his body.
Okay. Yeah. And that's like in the OA, they tattooed things, right?
Tattooed things, right? but these people had like a catalog of symbols, things on their bodies. And I'm like, what is this? Are these like programmed drones that like have to look at their bodies? Or is it like checking to see if I notice that these people don't fit in the same? They were always weird, right? And one day, like I met this guy who had an interesting tattoo that like resonated with what Michael and I were researching. And I made sure to like shake his hand so I could tell if he was like real and a real person, or if he was like one of these things. Right. But you see all these weird people out there on the trail. And like, if you don't actually touch them or bump into them, like, who knows if they're the same as you or I? Like the hologram could be that good. Also, like, and this happened, we started noting, we moved here during the lockdown. So I don't know if I would have seen it before or not, but when they started rolling out the medical countermeasures, right? That was happening right at the time we moved here. The way people move is very weird. Like it's not every day. Someday everyone looks normal. Yeah. But if there's people moving weird, then you'll see like 100 people moving weird with like strange gaits and spastic movements. It's almost like they're responding to some, controlling frequency or mechanism that is like bizarre. And at this point, like Laura and I will laugh. It's like, oh, it's going to be one of those days, right? Where, I mean, sometimes they like moving like animals. And it's very bizarre, right? So I think there's things, and I think this area downtown around the lake is like there's a lot of things. It's like an open laboratory as opposed to like the domain, which I would say is like a closed laboratory up by the Pickle campus, right? But it's amazing people watching. But what you were saying earlier about like robots, you said something earlier, there's a mural across the Lamar Street. Like there's a footbridge and then there's like a train track across it. And there's this mural that's been there since when I first visited Austin, but it's been added to. And it's kind of like, in my opinion, like a story of like what Austin has become. And the opening scene for it says, let's pretend we are robots. Right. And then it has like a dragon or a reptile breathing fire. And there's something that says, focus your intent on one point and dream. And then there's the Pink Floyd symbol with the prism hitting the pyramid. Right. And all of this is directly in front of and aimed at the area that I call the blast zone. Right. Right now. And then there's a little thing down further that has like a Pac-Man thing, like Pac-Man chasing ghosts and eating it, and some references to dancing. And that's like a meme in the rave world about if Pac-Man really affected us as children, we'd all be running around in the dark, listening to repetitive music and eating pills. Right. Kind of thing. Right. So, but it stretches all the way across the water. Right in front of that area that I'm telling you at the limestone and the power plant and whatnot. So,
and a lot of, those are sort of sacred springs, aren't they? Like the springs around Austin, like that's sort of a feature, like mineral springs, the indigenous springs, I think.
Yeah. Barton Springs. So there's Barton Springs, there's Deep Eddy, there's Hamilton Pool. There's all of these places. And it's actually interesting. You mentioned, when we talked last time, you asked if I thought it was something about the water that is making Austin be what it sort of is now. And I absolutely do, right? I have a lot of theories about the water. I don't know which one is right or if it's some of each or whatever, but you specifically mentioned Barton Springs. And actually, if you're in Barton Springs and you start swimming or start going in the water towards downtown, towards like Barton Springs is in complete eye shot from that same zone from the other direction, right? Okay. Like it opens right onto that area that I call the sort of blast zone. So I don't know, like the water there is very interesting. There's the Edwards Aquifer is under the ground there, which is kind of its unique feature. There's a lot of limestone around. Right. I've asked a lot of questions about what this really is. It's the Colorado River in Texas dammed into 7 lakes. And then there's the springs. I don't know if there's like an underground ocean down there. I've played with that idea. I don't know if there's pyramids under the water there. There seems to be a lot of art around the lake that would imply that like there's pyramids underneath the water that like have an invisible portion outside of the water that you can't really see unless you have the eyes to see it. I see a lot of things that I like to look at some of the graffiti and sort of try and pick up what it's putting down. I know for sure that a lot of people go missing in the water, and they don't really look for them, which I think is really odd.
Wow.
And there's this rule that you're not supposed to swim in the water, and there's like layers of like descriptions as to why, none of which makes sense. I don't know if it's just like bottomless down there and you just like swim into another reality if you're down there or whatnot. But some people have gone missing in the lake since I've been here. The lake is just 200 feet from where I am. They look for them for a very short time and then they stop. They don't do rescue really or anything like that. There was a plane that went down in the water. Like I was running on the trail and I saw this plane like go down and hit the water. And it was like someone from the Parks and Rec or whatever, someone from the national parks thing or whatever. They completely got disoriented and got lost in like their little plane and it crashed. It was like the weirdest story ever. Right. So I don't know if there's like a mini Bermuda Triangle over the lake there. I don't know. Right. But it's very weird. Okay. So we keep jumping around. Is there some place you wanted to go, or did you want me to? I wanted to ask you about the Scots and the Jamaicans.
I don't know. Yeah, we could do that.
Okay. And if you have a place you want to go, just jump in. So there's this guy that I learned about prismatic melanin from. His name is Kalindi E. Right.
Okay.
Right. And so I ended up buying this book. I brought up Kalindi and someone else told me about this book and I haven't read it yet. It's called Dark Light Consciousness, Melanin Serpent Power, right? And so he had this idea, or I don't know if it was his idea, but I heard him talk about it, that Black people, whether they be African or Jamaican or whatever, have a prismatic melanin in their body that makes them decipher information from the sun differently. Right. And that seems to be some of what this book is about. So Kalindi is this very interesting guy who would do like 50 grams of mushrooms at a time.
Oh, I heard about him. Yeah.
And he insists, and I think offers pretty good evidence that like mushrooms are some type of technology that is able to sort of store historical records in the sort of, you know, morphogenic field or in the Akasha or something, in that you can sort of time travel or dimensional travel to those places or times through using them. And he would talk about how like at a small dose of mushrooms, you might just perceive a little extra movement in your environment, right? And he would say that how you would know, like there's pieces of art that are designed to be looked at when you're on mushrooms, and how you would know is there would be something in that art that looked like a mushroom, like maybe the cave painting somewhere or some Egyptian scribe art. So if it looked like it had a mushroom on it, and then you take the mushrooms, if you take a low dose, things move and give a little extra information. At a higher dose, like it's sort of like the more psychic template where like all of a sudden the symbols are providing extra information. At another dose, the characters from the piece of art sort of come off the frame and start interacting with you in your environment. Like at a higher dose, you are stepping into their scene. So if there's like a scene where there's like, you know, pharaohs sitting around a table in Kemet, now you're at the table having the conversation with them. And he would give very detailed accounts about some of this kind of stuff. And he was very charismatic, and he would be, you know, put in the back room off in the corner at these psychedelic conferences, while like Michael Pollan, who's done 2 grams of mushrooms in his life, is like, you know, on the main stage telling everybody about how profound his experience was or whatever it was, right? But that's where I learned about it. He was also like an African style martial arts instructor. But what you were saying about the Scots in Jamaica, right? I wonder if the Jamaican plantation workers, right, like that, if the Scots going there and doing whatever they were doing, and I didn't get to do like the full read of everything, like they were there basically to collect data about reality from these people who have the prismatic melanin in their body, right? I don't know what the story is. Can you tell me a little bit about the Scots and the Jamaicans?
I mean, well, essentially, I wasn't familiar with the fact that like the Scotch were such a presence in Jamaica. Like I think Jamaica has the highest percentage of people of Scotch ancestry after Scotland.
Really?
So it's a lot. Yeah. And so much of the plantation culture there was the sugar plantations.
Okay.
And so, and again, you have the other, Rastafarian, other kinds of cultural stuff that came after. The reason I got to looking at it, actually, Raul Diego had written a piece talking about the Quakers, which I've been really focused on a lot being in Philadelphia and in the UK and this lunar society. And it came up as part of that, like that there were these Scots, well, the Barclays, and I don't think the Barclays were Scotch, but they came into possession of a group of enslaved people who had been mortgaged, and then they came into the hands of the Barclays, which is important because the Barclays are still sort of central in this game of blockchain and all of that other stuff. And they said, well, okay, we feel, Barclay and Lloyd's of the Barclays and is it Lloyd's? The Quakers were backing the slave trade, the high level financiers. Like on the surface, they were against it, but they were also actually financing it. They wouldn't sell people on a block, but they would manage the paperwork on behind the scenes. So it was not seemly for them to have these enslaved people. So they said, well, why don't you let them go? And they're like, well, we can't do that because that would upset things here in Jamaica, and that's just not done. But why don't we take them to Philadelphia and we'll put them on a work program, and then we'll reform them as people and like let them loose in Philadelphia. But they were monitored afterwards as far as their behaviors and their well-being. And so it turns out one of them, I'm trying to remember the guy's name. Maybe it was Octavius Barclay, but he was buried in a cemetery, Eden Cemetery, which is in Southwest Philly, sort of beyond outside of the city, which is where it was used to be the Bartram farm. And I used to work at Bartram's Garden, and we went on a tour of this cemetery. And so these enslaved Jamaicans were brought to Philadelphia and managed in a work program, not unlike what it's going to be like these blockchain impact bonds, and relocated here. So it sort of sat close with me, this idea of, again, the ripples of history of, plantation culture and what's coming next with data plantation culture. And then you had the addition of the sugar, and like, what is the role that the sugar biologically play and the melanin biologically play in this sort of optic or photonic computing that might be coming down the pipeline, and how this, again, ripples across time and in the fourth dimension, and like, maybe those times are not so far off as we think, or, maybe the energies of these times overlap. So that's what I was sort of thinking about. And then, so this Dallas family, this came up to my consciousness again, because when I came into the cemetery and the Dallas family, and I noticed it because I was going to go talk to Lynn in Dallas in a few hours. And so I looked them up, and I'm like, oh, well, they were one of these Scottish slaveholding plantation families. And actually, the brother of the guy who was buried wrote an entire book on maroons and maroon culture. So Maroonage were the enslaved people who would escape into the swamps to escape, being enslaved. And then that tendency of maroon culture, to me, always, like during lockdowns and seeing how things were happening, I'm like, there's stuff that there's histories that we should understand to learn how to navigate what's coming, like with the blockchain sensor network world. Like, there are lessons in this past time of how Maroonage, how the Maroons, which that approach was also in Brazil and in Florida and North Carolina, the swamps, that they would go into these remote areas and then live in sort of a, decentralized culture, outside of the structure. So, when I saw the cemetery was St. Peter's, which was Anglican. It was the second major Anglican Church of England. And of course, St. Peter is the key. He has the keys to the kingdom, and the keys are also central to both enslavement and blockchain identity, your public key and your private key. So there were all of these layers that were sort of appearing to me. And then in that particular, when I was picking up the feathers and I gathered them all, because literally, and they weren't goopy, like clearly some bird had gotten taken by a hawk or something, but it wasn't bloody. Like, they were still clean. You know what I mean? Like, I've seen times where I wasn't pulling them off a carcass. They were loose. So I gathered them all because it feels like that's what I was supposed to be doing. And then I sat down under this tree to read a little bit more about the cemetery. And it was talking about these significant trees. And trees, again, going back to the OA, like trees are a sort of a central feature that rippled through that story. But it turns out I was sitting under a Lebanon cedar. Like they made a distinguish of like, oh, and there are these two important Lebanon cedar trees here. And I'm like, okay, well, cedars of Lebanon. Oh, okay, that's King Solomon's temple, right? And so you've got the King Solomon's temple, which is the basis of Freemasonry. And I'm sitting here, and then we've got the Scots. So there are all of these sort of, you're probably one of the few people that like, it makes sense, like these loops, but you've got sugar and slaves and keys and blockchain and Freemasonry and Scots and sugar. And it's all kind of, anyway, in my head, it was like linking together. And then again, understanding Jamaican culture, you know, in that aspect of, you know, a sacred natural spirituality, and that as a contrast to the plantation culture. And just, anyway, it feels like there are lessons there. I can't put my finger exactly on at this moment what the lesson is, but it intersected with your lines of inquiry. So,
okay, so a couple things that there. So, do you remember in the season 2 of OA that there were some people joined the sleep study and they were sleeping in the sugar factory where
yes,
in that thing where that was like mining their dreams?
Yes.
Right. And they were having those weird phone call communications, and some people were communicating in the dream space. Like the fact that it was in the sugar factory was really interesting. And you have Esther Dyson doing sleep studies and monitoring the sugar, right? So I think this has been a long-term thing that has gone on when you have one group of people seeking to, for some reason, control another group of people, is to make their diet very sugar or carbohydrate centric, and then monitor their activities, their behaviors, when they sleep, when they work, all of that kind of stuff. But really, you're collecting information about them. The fact that they're producing labor for like and maybe you're collecting energy, maybe it's spiritual energy as opposed to like charging a battery kind of energy, right? But and so the fact that you can get them to produce goods for you or to do work for you, in my personal opinion, is a benefit, but not the point. The point is really you're trying to study these people and understand why they do the thing they do, why they make the choice they do, why their bodies produce more energy than your body does, why are they have lucid dreams when you're just having, you know, whatever. I'm sure there's like a million things, right? But this seems to be a connection as old as time. Coincidentally, this week I noticed that there's a place here in Austin called Scottish Woods. And I had never heard of that before. And I looked it up, and there's like a pool, a natural pool there called Sculpture. Hold on a second. Scottish Woods, Austin, Sculpture. There's like some interesting limestone pool. Here it is. It's up a little further up, like the Barton Creek kind of thing, right? I think it's this Sculpture Falls in Austin. This is in the Scottish Woods.
Oh, interesting.
It looks like some of that stuff in the Susquehanna River that sometimes Michael talks about.
Right.
But it's in this area called Scottish Woods that I hadn't heard of before. And of course, as soon as I found out about this area that day, I passed that street, the Scottish Woods Trail, for the first time, right? But are you, like, if you look at Scottish Rite Freemasonry, right? These are some of the logos here. And of course, there's some birds, and there's this cross that I have a lot of names for something like this. You can call it a Templar cross or a Scottish Rite cross, or I sometimes refer to it as a four-lobe shape or whatnot. But have you ever seen the video on the emergence of a light photon or the development of a light photon?
No.
Looks exactly like that the Templar's cross, right? So for creation of a light photon, there used to be a video, but that seems to be gone. But sometimes you can find this specific picture that really shows this one.
Oh, wow.
Okay, so there's a couple of different like iterations of it, but I originally saw the video in some thread that Tracy Twyman was doing years ago. And so I'm obsessed with this shape called a quatrefoil. Here's an interesting version of this. Look at this one, right? But this is like kind of how it emerges, and then it starts to develop and do all of these other things.
Well, can I tell you, like, it was weird last summer, in August, someone I had gotten to know online said, well, listen, I'm working at a resort in the Virginia in the Shenandoah, and like I have this place. There's extra bed if you want to like just get away. And at the time there was like I was just going through a rough patch, so I was like, sure, like so I went down, and we had quite a number of interesting experiences there. And I rented like an Airbnb later, so that we were going to make it. We went to Walter Russell's museum. You talked about Walter Russell. We had a very odd experience in his museum. Like you have to, like at the time you had to arrange a private tour. And it's where I was leaving. I realized that our guide had a Masonic tie tack. And so, so I have, let me see. I still have to read this one, but like, The Secret of Light. Yep. So, and we ended up at the Stanton ruined sanitarium where they were doing forced sterilization. And we went far enough afield that I rented this little cabin place that looked quaint for a couple nights. And the woman she said, oh, by the way, like up in the back field, if you walk up, there's a labyrinth. Now, the place that the woman was working, the resort, it was run by the Church of England. Okay. So it was 1,000 acres in the Shenandoah. The largest wooden building in Virginia, huge, and it had all these outbuildings, and supposedly they just hosted band camps and reunions. And I'm looking around going like, it was immaculate, right? And it's hard to keep a wooden building that's a lot of money. That's a money pit. And so, but on the property of this resort, it had, there were still only 3 left, but sacred mineral springs from the original Indigenous people. And an open air chapel with all sorts of names like built. It was open air with the stone of the mountain, and the baptismal font for it was an Indian corn grinding bowl, right? Just wild. Like, and so it felt like in some ways that this Anglican, was holding something important, like that there was no reason they would pour all this money into just running a reunion event hall space, like that this was an excuse to hold this land. And so then we went to this little cabin, which was, I don't know, an hour and a half further down the road, down 81. And sorry. So within this resort, there was an Ariadne's web labyrinth, like a stone that you could walk the labyrinth, a meditated labyrinth. So I was like, oh, okay, I'll walk the labyrinth. So we walk, and someone earlier had sent me in the lockdowns a picture, and she was walking in Ariadne's labyrinth in the snow in Canada. And so I kind of had this thing with the labyrinth in my head. So we stay at this cabin, and they're like, oh, well, there's a labyrinth on the top of the hill. And there's this huge view. And this is, not far from Charlottesville, and you can walk up, if the weather's nice, and walk the labyrinth. And it had all sorts of unusual metal sculptures with crystals in them. And then in the middle of the labyrinth was a cross just like that.
Yep.
And I messaged her like through the Airbnb thing. And I was like, hey, like, could you tell me like what's up with this? And it had like crystals embedded in it and everything. So we set an intention there, but I never got a response about what exactly it was. And it was strange because when we went up, we would not have even seen the labyrinth because it was in the grass, and the grass had grown up. So if you weren't really looking, you wouldn't have seen it. But there was an old guy on a tractor, and it was almost like in a game. Like the old guy in the tractor is waiting for us to show up and ask, like, where's the labyrinth? And he's like, oh, it's right there. You couldn't see it. It was like right before you. So anyway, I just feel like the photonics and the light and these symbols, and the fact that they didn't, like, there were several articles about like labyrinths in Virginia that you could go, and it was on private land. So I think you couldn't just wander in. I mean, you probably could, but it was like a controlled access, and this person was very new agey, so. Anyway, so
a couple of things you said. How familiar with Walter Russell are you? Have you ever seen his periodic tables?
It's been a bit. Yeah. I was looking, I mean, they had the images and so that's the thing. Like, and yeah. And also the power, like he had some sort of like machine that he said he gave to NORAD.
Right. So these are some of his charts that he made. He had his own periodic table that was spiral as opposed to just a graph. So you could look at it this way, right? You could look at it like this, or he could lay it out into it linearly so you could read, and it had to do with different elements having different harmonics and the light color spectrum and all kinds of things that I don't completely understand. But he also, I'll show you the graph of his machine. Walter Russell's machine is quite interesting. This is not, that's not what I'm talking about. Where's his machine? There's these are the drawings of his machine. Right. He has a variety of different, there's one in particular that I'm looking for that I can't, he has all these drawings that he made of them.
They're amazing.
They're amazing. Right. But I mean, the YouTube channel FPV Angel talks a lot about Walter Russell's machine in terms of their cosmology of what they think the Earth is and how it actually works, and particle accelerators play into a lot. They do a really good job of like explaining his graphs and his machines and how it all works. And it's above my head, some of it. But my guess would be that whatever minerals were there in that water that you were talking about, they had certain sculptures and they were pulling together some of these minerals and metals and stuff like that in the water to create a specific type of energy field. My guess would be that at certain times of year, people go there for either some kind of ritual or some kind of healing practice or something like that. The Scottish Rite, this symbol, right, that is the creation of a light photon, right? So what I started to discover about it, like I've been obsessed for quite a while with this shape called the quatrefoil. It's used very frequently in one of its iterations. There's a million iterations of it that you'll see. This was also like the rosette window in the OA, right? The iteration that I'm mostly kind of fixated on is more like this. It's typical in mid-century modern design. You'll see like concrete masonry blocks that have like a quatrefoil type of design. Let me see if I can find one that is sort of like exactly the way that I see it. But you see this in a lot of religious ornamentation. You see it in a lot of design. It's also how you draw a Masonic floor as you start with that shape. So the Masonic floor is actually like an idea that you can project out into space as opposed to like just the way a specific lodge's floor is designed. So you'll see this a lot of times on these kinds of sacred windows and whatnot, right? But I was here in Austin, and then there's like an inverse shape of it, which is kind of like this, right? Like this is the middle portion between the leaves, and there you can see it everywhere. And it's always been around, but it's on everything now. Like there's not an Airbnb I don't go into that has something with it on it. It's like everywhere. It's like a hiding in plain sight, like the secret of something, right? And I realized when I was in Austin a couple of years ago visiting, and we were having a very OA-like day in terms of some of the places that we had been, we walked into a bookstore and there was a flask that had what looked like a quatrefoil to me on it. But when I turned to the other angle, I saw that it was the Templar's cross. It was a Templar's cross on a flask. So then I realized that all of these Masonic organizations that use that kind of cross, like the negative space of that is this quatrefoil, right? Which to me symbols that this is like some sort of dimensional location. This is like where there's like a portal or an opening or something like that, right? And I've been chasing this forever. Like I've gone into like a million iterations of the way that I see it, right? And one of the things that we were looking at back here when we were on the creation of a light photon, right? Like you see these versions like here and here, right? So this would be like this and this would be iterations of the quatrefoil is the way I see it. And I was doing research on something completely else the other day, but at this point there is no completely something else. Like everything at this point has become connected. And I found this interesting document that I think I still have open somewhere, but I have so many things open on my, here we go, on my computer that it's become, can you see this?
Yeah.
Okay. So I was looking at something about, like, my mother worked for Arco Corporation, right? And their symbol is like, it's a version of the quatrefoil. And I was looking at that, and then I was looking at some other things, and I found my way to this cathartic grid document, which now for some reason my computer won't open. And I found this really interesting document right here. I don't know what this is, but it has like elements of like the tree of life, and it looks like that thing from the light photon right here. And it's talking about like the Akasha. And remember, you sent me that document about the Akashic Space Force or whatever, and invading that, and pockets of information hidden in the causal plane and all of this kind of stuff. But this seems to be using this shape as like coordinates to various levels of reality, right? And so I'm down that sort of rabbit hole. But if you look at the exact shapes, they call it an Akashic corridor, right? It looks exactly like the hologram of a single light photon, right? And so this photonic thing, like, I think maybe some people generate more the radial energy, the spiritual energy, light photons, right? And this is what some of the prismatic melanin is about. Like, I don't know if this is some sort of neurochemical or biochemical in the body that takes in the energy from the sun and then radiates out something different that these Scottish people were fascinated with and were wanting to either be near to power their own whatever it is, or to study or something like that, right? But this happens over and over and over again, right? In like a variety of different ways. And I think this prismatic, this whole, this book seems to be like about some sort of level of consciousness that seems to want to be penetrated by something getting into the blood-brain barrier, right? Which gets into all the things.
Well, it's interesting because like the clip with Juan Benet of Protocol Labs and this guy, Adam Marblestone, and they were talking about non-surgical brain-computer interfaces. And again, the way they were talking about it was sort of like, you know, still to come, and how would we finance it, and how would we sort of silo the information to have these people work on the outside part of the brain and these people work on the inside part of the brain, and then later bring it around together. But they were specifically talking about like ultrasound frequency modulation in the brain, which sounds a lot like what you were talking about with the Lilly waves, you know, and using that to compromise the blood-brain barrier. So, you know, but ultimately, you know, if they're very good at it, they're going to be able to frame this as a human rights issue, that everyone should have this, you know, and I can see this now, is that like this becomes a, you know, the next bridging the digital divide is like, you know, how dare there be some people left out who don't have the non-surgical brain computer interface.
Right. Yes.
Yeah.
Right. Or who does, like, so
rather than being part of some sort of like crazy Frankensteining experiment, it'll be like, well, how can you not? Like, we should make sure that everybody does.
So that in the sugar thing, that was part of the Syzygy Corporation, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So when you sent me something about Syzygy, I read the things you sent and I looked at all of that, but I always go look at other expressions of the same thing. And I found this, and I think Syzygy psychedelic therapy.
Oh, I missed that one.
Look at this one. Right. And so if you think about like what they were doing in that study right there, and this is what you're talking about, is everybody is going, it needs to have access to this. And I don't think the access is going to come like through Elon Musk's Neuralink or somebody getting a chip in the thing or whatever.
Yeah.
I think it's going to come through the microdosing and the psychedelic therapy.
Yeah.
I found some article the other day about them using yeast to grow psychedelics. Right. And that one of the things that they're doing with this push for legalization is they want to extract the only specific like parts of the site. They don't want the natural thing. They want to create a synthetic one. And they're now growing synthetic psychedelics in yeast. right? And eventually
as a bioreactor.
as a
Interesting.
as a bioreactor. And if you have what I was talking about in those videos, that sort of yeast complex in the body, which is a great environment for parasites, for Morgellons, for nanotechnology, it loves it. If you starve the body of sugar, the yeast will die and all that stuff will start to come out. If you have that active, it's just like running an overlay system inside of you, right?
Yeah.
And so the syzygy psychedelic, the psychedelic therapy is going to be, you know, sort of thriving on this environment in the body. Like eventually, first they'll grow psychedelics in a yeast environment outside of the body, and you'll take
and
them.
then they'll bring it in.
You got it.
Yeah. Well, and somebody shared with me on one of my comments recently a paper about like alternative neural networks, specifically in like sea creatures, but you know, like invertebrate kind of sea sponges and different things, and looking at the different evolutionary tracks that things that present as nerves, but may not be presenting exactly how we understand nerves in our body, but in different, like what the different parameters were. And I think maybe it was even Levin in one of his comments, he was talking about nerves existing so far back, even before multicellular organisms. And he talked about intelligent biofilms, like intelligent bacterial biofilms. And so if you know, and I think that's related to the yeast colonization stuff, is these biofilms, but they have their own intelligence. And so if you imagine like you're hijacked by your own, you know, some other program that's subroutine that is running under your existing program that is maybe subliminally directing according to its own needs and desires. You know, I feel like that's a piece of it, that the yeast. And then Steffer shared with me something more recently about like the mycelial, like now they're working with the fungal stuff in the bioreactors. So like, oh, we haven't paid enough attention to all the sustainable ways that we can use, you know, fungal things, but not necessarily for psychedelics per se, because that's its own huge thing. But like, how do we make new kinds of food out of it? How do we make new sorts of things that we wear, all these other materials? And so I feel like that networking system, what happens if like within those, whatever those junctures, you know, that create the mind meld, like what if the cells of these intelligent films or intelligent mycelial networks are able to, and Levin talks about it, parasitically get into and access our own cellular structures and our own biology or our own psychology. So
that is essentially what Morgellons is. Okay. I don't know, like if you've personally had any experience with that, or I'm sure you've talked to some people who
I know, I'm aware of it. I didn't really think how it presents.
I thought, so during the time that I was struggling with that, like I thought like the things I was reading, right, led me to believe that under an environmental attack or targeted individual. Later, I came to believe that it was probably that they were in the drug, whatever it is. I was getting it because I was doing drugs. There was some sort of like nanotechnology or some sort of self-replicating something or other that they were like, people who do drugs, like this is a great, you know, we can experiment on them because anything weird that happens, we can just say they have psychosis and they're picking their skin or whatever. Right. So I thought it was that, but then I realized later when I had a bigger understanding of how it develops that like I had a few symptoms of it long before I ever did drugs. Right. And I think it just got worse when I was doing drugs because there was probably more stuff. There's probably stuff coming in, or maybe that the drugs themselves for some reason was like food to the stuff that was already in my body, in addition to the sugar I was eating and whatnot. I had all kinds of crazy shit going on. Like I had things coming out of my body that looked like little parts of machines. I had like weird silicone looking chips coming out of my body. Like but when I was like a teenager still, like in the 90s, and definitely not on drugs then, very healthy. Like I had this one spot on my arm that like, you can still see the scar there, where like something weird would come out of there that looked like a piece of like glitter, like iridescent glitter, over and over and over. The same thing would come out.
Oh, wow.
And there's, you know, what later I saw that people were pulling out of them as part of, you know, the Morgellons kind of stuff. But I had weird, like mechanical looking feathers, bugs, like things that were like, what is this? Right. But one of the things I also had was you develop sometimes like, have you ever used new skin? If you got like a cut or something, there's that stuff that you could paint. Or when you were little, did you ever put glue on your hands and then peel it off?
Yeah.
Your skin would start to look like that. And you didn't have new skin or glue on, like, or whatever, right? And one time, and this was like one of the weirdest things I've ever experienced, and I still don't know what to make of it. But like I had like a huge something going on my face, right? I was on drugs and I like broke open something and there was just like blood gushing down my face. There was a huge hole in my face, right? Because I pulled some shit out, right? In front of my face in the mirror, the skin fucking grew together and closed over. And it was like, you could still see underneath it that there was blood underneath it, but there was like the new skin that you put over it. And it healed perfectly. Like I have, you can see though, if you were here and I showed you that the skin is a slightly different color because it's like young, it feels like baby skin. It's like younger skin, right? It's the, I mean, like I didn't know, like I was just like, I'm going to pretend I didn't see that because I'm high as a fucking kite and that's going to sound crazy, but I can't forget that it happened, right?
Right.
I also had one time, like there was something like black under my skin. And when I tried to like go after it, it like moved inside, like it was sentient and, you know, whatever. And I was just like, what the fuck is this shit? Like, well, I wonder about graphene and sugar. You sent me something about graphene and sugar, and graphene seems to have an intelligence and wants to collect. And so maybe once it's exposed to oxygen, like it moves away from that, right? Type of thing. I don't know what to make of all of this kind of stuff, but the biofilm, I think, is some sort of like intelligent skin. It's like an intelligent, like synthetic skin that like understands how to close up right. I don't know. It's fucking weird, but I've talked to a few other people that have had similar types of things happen, right? I don't know, but what I was reading about from some of the things that you sent, like that's what it sounds like. As for the parasites, like I think that I don't know if these are synthetically created parasites or if like Morgellons is like some kind of weird tag that gets on other parasites that are in your body and sort of like, it's like putting a chip on something, like, you know, that to track it through or whatever it is. If something's trying to control any parasite activity that might be in the body, like if parasites take over a system, they're good for that. You don't need to reinvent the wheel, but if you want to get the parasites to do what you want them to do instead of what they want to do or whatever it is, then if you tag them with something, right? And I think this is actually the source of all of the chaos around ivermectin, is that it has little, if anything, to do with the COVID thing, but it's about that there's a parasite system that they had been developing in the body for a really long time. And ivermectin is an anti-parasite and it was inconvenient.
I think actually they want ivermectin in people. But
but
I think they want it to, they think they want to tell you shouldn't have it so that you'll want it. But I think it has to do about like some sort of cell transportation, because the Vagelos, the guy who developed it, he literally has endowed 4 biotech buildings at Penn.
Right. I mean, it could be that as well. Like it could be.
So there's some sort of there's something going on with that. Yeah. Well, that's to be continued. I'm not sure exactly the whole thing about but like what I was saying, like going back to the whole microdosing and that sort of thing, is that weirdly the pay for success finance structure that is sort of my wheelhouse. Protocol labs, affiliated people are really already developing pay for success impact deals for psilocybin. So they're already, I mean, and of course, Peter Thiel is deeply in that space. And, you know, even, you know, Stamets, like I was talking about that, like coming, you know, I think that they're going to come up with some ways to develop, like reframe this as a public good, but then have programmable things that are linked into, oh, wow, that is so unpleasant.
But this is what this is what you pull out of your skin when you have Morgellons. You pull things out that look like this somehow.
Wow. Well, in the Stealing Fire book, they were talking about the future, in the not too distant future, where everybody would have a 3D printer in their home for drugs, and you would upload your own custom psychedelics. But the thing is, like, I can imagine that they would be precision, that this would be linked into some sort of precision medicine tailored to you, and that there would be some compliance protocol that if you decided to discontinue their program, that then you couldn't leave your house, or, they turn off your grocery delivery or something like that. Like that's where the interconnectedness of all of this becomes such a problem.
So look at these, whatever, this could be snake, serpent, parasite. It's obviously in the brain. This is supposed to be the brain, right? But there's some light spectrum ray thing here. So I don't know if this is like photonic energy or whatever. You were talking about the mycelia. There's another show called Sensate. I don't know if you've ever seen it. There's some similarities between it and the OA and some differences. It's by the Wachowski brothers, sisters, whatever.
Yeah.
There's a cluster of people that are connected by a silicyl network that makes them telepathic with each other and basically able to experience sort of like cellular teleportation, right? Where they can experience the life of each other type of thing, and have access to each other's giftings and whatnot. And then there's it's similar to the OA. There's people hunting them for this ability, and then people trying to control this ability, and all of that type of thing. I'm very suspicious also of like mushrooms for everything right now. Right? Like, like it's very the mushrooms exist as part of nature, and I definitely enjoy psychedelic mushrooms, but I'm concerned with I'm concerned with synthesized versions of anything, because it's like, it's an entire thing. And if you're going to experience it, just like taking out the part that is for this, you hear them talking about like removing the spiritual aspect of it, but just keeping in the part that helps people be creative or film. Like, what are you talking about? That's the spiritual part, right?
Part. Yeah,
but exactly. They want to just isolate the analogs so that, they can control it. They want to synthesize it. They don't want you taking the one that you grew yourself or whatever. And
a lot of this, like with the controlled substances, I think they're using like quantum dots and nano to track it. So you create the legalization, and then within the legalization structure, you create the structure for tracking and managing everything, which is now related, like the tagging and the tracking is the nanotechnology structures. So then essentially you've embedded, like that's what was happening in cannabis, that you legalize, and then you manage it and again, like under grow lights and different sort of conditions that are not natural. And who knows if you're growing in those artificial environments, is there programming that goes in with the photonic aspect of that?
Yes. I read an article about sound treated cannabis, right? Oh. That was going to be available, for therapeutic reasons or whatever. So if you can,
you don't know what it was programmed yet.
Right. So the thing you said about the quantum dots, that's like, they're these tiny little black specks, right? And you can use them for tracking or tracing, but then there's other ones that they just look like the black specks, but as soon as they get in the body and there's certain like iron or certain hormones or whatever, they start to go into different things, and they connect with other things in the body, and they start creating an entire system inside the body. And I remember like probably around 2012 or 10 or something like that, there was a document about this type of thing. It was like a Morgellons document. It went missing from the internet, but they called it like seeds to crystals to nano machines to something else, that showed the progress of what these things do when they sort of interconnect and bloom into, if you look at it from a different perspective, it gives an entirely different understanding of self-transforming machine elves that kind of talks about, right? But it ends up looking sort of like some of the things you see when you look at some of the stuff that some people say are inside the shots or whatever.
Yeah.
Or, if you look at, there's one particular kind of crystal, I think it's called bismuth. It's this one, that it looks sometimes like this.
Interesting.
Have you seen this kind of, like, this is one of those weird crystals that is like not fully organic, right? But it does this kind of thing.
Yeah, it's like fractal kind of.
Yeah. Which have you, and you can even see there's this one, these ones look like pyramids and stuff like that, right? It's kind of crazy. Have you heard of genetic cities?
No.
I got one that you hadn't heard of.
I don't know all the things. There's a lot of things I don't know.
I thought you might know about this one. Someone I do some shows with brought me something about genetic cities. I'm going to send it to you. I don't understand it well enough to speak intelligently about it. But it's pretty interesting to look at the structures. And when we were looking at the crystals, it made me think of that. I think the architecture is symbolizing that, right? If you look at some of the architecture that we see now, some of it looks like technology, some of it looks like musical instruments to me. And then others, like if you look at our skyline here, it looks like genetic marker tests or like the printout of a PCR test, right?
Oh.
And then my friend came to me with this whole thing about genetic cities, and Houston is going to be the first genetic city or whatever.
Oh, wow. Now, what does that mean? Is that's the industry of the city, or?
I have it. Let me see if I can pull it up in a second. Here it is.
Of course, it's Houston, NASA, and biotech, and rice.
Let's see. All right. So it's Houston, like as a genetic city. And this isn't the good one. There was one other one that I had a picture of. Well, that's the book. There was another document that I had open that had better pictures to look at. Where did it go? I'll send you it. I have it open in some window somewhere on my computer here, but there, oh, here it is. This is the one, I think. Oh no, is this it? No, the thing I have is a PDF that actually lets you look through it. I'll send it to you. But I was just curious, and your lookings about that. But when we were looking at the bismuth, it made me think of it.
Yeah, no, I mean, I feel like there's so much happening in Houston with the nanotech and rice and the space program. And I was pulling slides for another slide deck recently around, I was sort of making the connection between like frequency-based healing and smart meters and digital identity and these electrical currency grids, and revisiting rice and like it's this quote unquote space medicine. And that the early remote monitoring of biological systems was linked to NASA. So it, ostensibly for the astronauts to get the data back on their living system. So all of the telemedicine, like eventually we could like pin back onto NASA, but it was specifically the Gemini mission, which was quite interesting given that now it's the digital twin, is the health data is your digital twin, that it was the Gemini mission that NASA set up the space.
You had that one slide that showed the guy getting his that test, and they were using
yeah.
Okay, so what you're talking about in Houston, they used to refer to Houston as Space City. I used to go to a lot of parties there, and there's like a group that threw parties, those Space City raves kind of thing, right? Okay. So it was the Space City, and now it's going to be the Genetic City, right? So do you know who Regina Dugan is? Okay, so she used to work for DARPA, but now she works for Welcome Leap, and she's head of this program called Project Delta Tissue. Right. And it's an integrated platform predicting changes in tissue state. And
that's some morphogenesis stuff, right? Wow.
She talks about, just like Sputnik was to develop exploring space, Delta is to exploring tissue or something. There was like an interesting article. I don't know if this is the exact one, but she's basically saying we're not studying look at the symbolism for this delta tissue, or it's like that symbol. We're not studying, we're done researching space, now we're into tissue and genetics, right? So which to me, like, I don't think space exists in the way that they have said it does, right? Yeah. But I don't know if I mean that metaphorically or actually, but she's interesting in this. Welcome Leap has all this interesting projects and programs they're into, this multi-channel psych stuff and whatnot, right? But she's an interesting character, Regina Dugan. But that machine, that exact machine that you were showing in that slide. So my friend, Anne, the nutrition mentor who died, and then I had this whole sugar is programmable matter thing, she had one of those machines. And she did it to me. So she was a naturopath and a nutrition consultant. And she became very well known for her work on candida, which is yeast. She was like the big expert on that. She died in a very unusual way. And one day when her mother is not here, I'll expound on what I think is really going on. But for now, I choose to honor my friendship with her mother and not speak too much about that. I'll tell you offline sometime. But she had one of those. And the very first time I went to see her, I was her client. And then I worked for her, and then I was her friend, and man, she mentored me, and I learned all the things I know about nutrition from her, minus the sugar is programmable matter stuff that I sort of got in the days after she passed. But you put it on, and it's weird, like, but there's a special computer it plugs into, and it produced all it was this thing that went around my head. Maybe there was two other parts, and I sat in it for like 10 or 15 minutes, right? And I still have the pages that it produced. The amount of information that it produced on me was crazy. This happened in the first 20 minutes that I met her. And what she was able to tell about me from reading this, right, was insane. And some of this, you could go, okay, well, that's voodoo, maybe, blah, blah, blah. But there was things that she said to me based on looking at the printout of this that were like secrets that I had never told anybody else. Things about myself, right? And
about your health, like
it looked at your health, but it also looked at your energy, your psychological state, what this was. And she told me about it. She's like, NASA used this for the moon missions. The idea is that you can get a snapshot on how fit somebody is for a difficult or a high stress situation based on these readouts that check all the subtle energies for physical health, energetic health, spiritual health, psychological health, and they in a good frame of mind for a high stress, all this kind of stuff.
Oh, interesting.
Some of the things that she said to me, she also was very intuitive. She was a very psychic type person anyway. So these were general word. It would just give one word, but she was extrapolating based on the combined things. And if I hadn't taken such a quick liking to her and already liked her as much as I did the moment I met her, I would have been highly disturbed that somebody could reach into my mind and pull out the secrets. So whatever that machine is, it's a very deep profile of a person. I don't know.
Well, imagine that it comes like Esther Dyson wants to give one to everybody, and Peter Thiel.
Well, think about her with this, like, okay, she does sleep studies. And she wants you to have the glucose monitor all the time, right? And so her dad is with the Dyson Spheres guy. And it's funny that you sent me that because Nish and JJ and I just did a show on Dyson Spheres, completely independently of anything I had talked about with you. But I showed them what you sent, and it just deepened the mystery. So, no, I think that I think her idea.
Well, and the thing is, like, I feel like in that episode of the OA where they had a group of people around a central device having their REM dreams transcribed. And then later it turns out that they say, okay, well, we're compiling all of these dreams, many, many, many into machine learning, right? And the basis of that was that in the 30s, when Hitler first came to power, there was someone, and this is actually true, was gathering all of these dream states that seemed to be precognition of what would come afterwards in the Holocaust. And so there was this power in tapping into this collective unconscious towards, precognitive stuff, precognition. And so I feel like that's what's going on there, is the tapping into the precognitive aspects with these technologies. Now in the OA, they have someone sitting bedside with these people because these are the high performing dreamers, right? But for the rest of us, you can imagine your Nest, because that's something I did. I looked up the Nest sleep monitoring program, and it's all radar. I mean, and that's the thing that was a bit shocking to me, was that you don't have to have a wearable, that it's watching you and listening to you, and that's sorting out exterior noise, your breathing noise, your moving noise. It knows you. But if it's radar, I think it seems like it's also potential that to project outward some frequency, right? If it's understanding frequency, it could probably reciprocate a frequency. And then what is that next step? So I feel like, imagine you've got, and early on, I was in touch with some, and several people who identified as targeted individuals, and they were saying that the worst symptoms were when they were trying to go to sleep at night, like they could feel like a drone surveillance or something like in that space. And I think there is like the etheric, this transition, like so if you, I don't know, I'm just like, what if we normalize this idea that everybody has a sleep aid, everybody has Esther's 5 sleep aids and their glucose, and then we go into sleep, and then somehow the sleep data is collected. Like, what happens if it's a machine of the level of granular assessment that you saw in that office? And then what if it has a steering capacity, right? Like, what if you're, I mean, I don't know, it sounds like some other episode of Netflix, but that the collective cognition could be used for prediction as a prediction machine.
Yep.
And then also for possibly steering or, implanting, which goes back. I mean, that goes way back to all of that learning in your sleep. I don't know if who was the main guy behind that, but like the tapes, the sleep training tapes and the sleep learning tapes and all that. Like,
well, there's also the gate. That's part of the gateway. It was hemisync, which is a little different. You're not necessarily asleep. It's deep meditation, right? But this is about like out of body experiencing and all kinds of stuff that, like, I don't know. I wasn't aware of this when I was younger, but when I found out about it, most of it sure happened to sound like lots of things that I had been through and experienced and whatever. Right. So I think that's right. I guess for me, it's like, people always think about what is being done to us. Like, oh, we're being mind controlled. Oh, we're being steered. And I certainly have spent plenty of years thinking about that. But I think still at the bottom of it, they so desperately need information from us for some project they're working on that they can't do without us. And when you start to look into Dyson spheres, I don't know how much you've looked into Dyson spheres at all. It seems highly dependent. Not at all.
I mean, a little bit. I mean, it's like around the sun, right? Like for capture and then civilizations in there or something like that.
It's basically like finding like all of these ways to create enough energy to build machines to travel to other worlds, to create more energy. Like everything seems like it's like this weird, like it's very strange. But we did this show kind of about the idea of the possibility that Earth itself is a Dyson sphere, or that they're trying to push us into this Dyson sphere. We just kind of tossed the idea around.
Well, often they talk about post-Kardashev society, like, and that seems to be this hook, like unlimited energy, and then what happens when you get access to that. But people, we know about the suppression of free energy technologies, right? But then they're always talking about all these projects they want to do, but they can't do them because they don't have free energy. So how could they not have something that they're suppressing, right? So like the question that I've been asking lately is, there some tremendous store of energy that they're desperate to have freed? And is that something that's inside of particular people? They're trying to free the energy, right, for use. I mean, I'm playing around with all kinds of iterations of it, but the whole thread on that, the position that they're sleeping in, right, it's kind of interesting. And then you also, I'm sure you saw in the show that the glass cages he kept them in were exactly the same as the fish tank in the second layer of reality as well. But that also is laid out in that octagonal shape in like the same way as the sleeping pattern, right? Like there's some radial, right? The radial energy.
So that's back to the spiritual energy of
well, and I think that, I mean, they say these tags are soul-bound tokens.
Yeah.
And I think that's, that some of the challenge, like navigating these waters, is that spirituality for the past, throughout my lifetime has sort of either, if not been under outright attack, then at least dismissed as like cuckoo or wackos, or, across things. So like the Christians, they're always like the radical right-wing Christians, or the, Islamic terrorists, or like every religion, they're like, it's an extremist position. And so it rarely actually taps into the other aspects. And then the sacred that are non-traditional, the big religions, and that's like some flaky new age stuff, right? And so that becomes suppressed, and you can hear it in Levin. Essentially, he's a total materialist. Like there's nothing here. But it's a weird materialism because he imagines matter is completely programmable if you just have the right equation. But spirituality or this idea of something beyond is totally dismissed out of hand. And so I think that level of suppression is because that is intrinsically the kernel, right? Like the light within, which, you know, is part of the whole Quaker thing. But it has, I think it's going to have to exist outside of the institutional structures.
100%.
Because the institutional structures have fully been embedded in the coding program. Like religion is the oldest code.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with you. I think there's been a lot of capturing and co-opting and whatever of all of that kind of thing. Also, like very much any exclusion of the unique qualities of the individual, right? Like you have a lot of people who will say free energy technologies aren't real because they're not reproducible. Well, what if part of it has to do with the person who's doing the experiment? What if it's something unique about their energy field that is like the missing part of the equation?
That's what they said about Keeley, right? Like it was only like good people. Like if you couldn't have the bad people do it because it would have worked.
It would be
like he created an equipment, like etheric equipment.
Yep.
And then they went and like after he got run over by a car, like went and disassembled, like the people from Penn literally went over and disassembled his workshop and they're like, it didn't work.
So having that conversation with you about Keeley bled into a couple of my shows in the last few weeks. But with Nish and JJ, I did a show called the Dyson Disco Muppet Manifesto, and we showed John Keeley's machine. And I'm proposing that whenever you see a disco ball in a party or a nightclub, there's actually one of his machines inside there that is trying to, right? Like if you look at it, it looks exactly, if you look at a disco ball hanging down and then you look at his thing right side up, right? And the disco ball being almost like the inversion, right? Because it's hanging the opposite way, right?
Oh, okay.
Right. But the energy generator, or there's also like, there's an idea of like an orgone accumulator. Do you know what an orgone accumulator is? Right. So disco balls in nightclub, let's say people are dancing and they're generating energy if something is being sort of collected inside of this, that then is like a free energy type of generator for something else. Right. So, I mean, some of it was very synchronistic, but his machine is fascinating to look at.
Yeah.
And did you see?
Go back and look at the machine? Yeah.
Have you seen the disco ball? It looks like I have the John Keeley machine. I forget what he called it, but here we go. So this is what it looked like, but right here, and it was housed inside of this. So it looks like a disco ball.
Oh, wow.
Inside is this. And so if you turn this upside down and put the disco ball right on top, outside of it,
yeah, I can see that.
Like a disco ball, right? So we were kind of going on about some of that. Like he had a few different iterations of it housed in different ways and expressed different ways. But this is the etheric force machine, right? So, but yeah, I mean, but that's it. So like if the individual, if it's like,
and then Ethereum, you know, the payment, like in the game, right? They got paid in Ethereum and Ether.
Yeah. All right. 2 more things I want to ask you about. And then I have a dinner reservation in a little while that I need to get ready for. So the Cedar of Lebanon in your outing the other day, like that seemed like one of the asides. I'm like, how did we switch to the Freemasonry and the Cedar of Lebanon? So I don't know if Danny told you this, but like Cedars of Lebanon is a focus of our work.
Oh no, I didn't know that.
We were both born at the Cedars of Lebanon Hospital.
Oh,
yeah. And if you look into what Cedars of Lebanon is, it's the 34th secret degree of Masonry, right?
Oh.
And it's associated with the Blue Lodge.
Okay.
And the Blue Lodge, so the Cedars of Lebanon Hospital is now the Church of Scientology. And the Church of Scientology, when they moved in, they painted it blue. So like, I think that some of that information is housed, like Scientology is one of these like weird cults where they're like doing some experimentation, but it's like, it's a front for something else type of thing. Right. But wherever I've gone in my life, soon as I moved there, like a Scientology office pops up right near where I moved, and something with the name Cedar or Cedars of Lebanon. In fact, I moved back here to Austin where it's like all cedar fever, and there's some interesting spiritual thing. But what's interesting is we were doing some research on it, and the chapter of Cedars of Lebanon that is still operant in Los Angeles is in a building I used to go to buy drugs, right? Right. So I thought it was funny that came into your thing. What is your, so are you saying that you were looking at it because the Solomon's temple was built from cedar of cedar? How is that? How are you?
So I was just like, literally, so I ended up like, it was a nice tree, and it's nice to sit under like a piney kind of tree. Mm-hmm. And so I sat down and I was like, well, let me look and see what it is about the cemetery. Now, trees, I like trees, and that's one of the first things that came up beyond who's buried there. Now, the first woman who was buried there, she, Eliza Pinckney, was the creator of the indigo culture in South Carolina. Mm-hmm. So indigo has its own sort of keenness as a color, and, so it's a different plantation color, but indigo. And so she was, I don't know that she really did it, but she's uplifted as the person who developed, this young woman who developed this as an industry in South Carolina. And then it said there were Osage orange trees that were descended from the Osage oranges that were brought by Lewis and Clark. So Philadelphia is really a center of botany because of all of the early scientists and the explorers. So there were quite a number of significant trees in the churchyard. And so I'm reading about them. And then it said, oh, and by the way, there are these cedars of Lebanon. So I'm just looking at it again. It was really more just but what was the story being told in this cemetery with the Dallas family, with the Pinckney family? Nicholas Biddle was also buried in the cemetery, and he was the head of the second bank, which was the first central bank of the U.S. This idea of exploration, this idea of keys and plantation culture, and like it was just all sort of, pulling together for me. Oh, and I mean, the other thing about, Anglican Church of England is really central, but they would have these box pews that you would have to rent. So again, it's like an enclosure, really, like you're paying for your own enclosure. I don't know if it was hard for me to find. I think in my slide deck, I found a picture of the cedar. It was like off to one side on the little bench, but you can see it's a very cheerful, not cheerful, but I like a nice cemetery, and you can see like in the city, there's not a ton of, I think that might be a different St. Peter's. Okay. Yeah, but they're very sustainable. I don't know, like it just felt like the world was telling me a story that day. And I sat down and I'm like, well, there must be something here. And it's like, well, here, let me tell you about indigo plantations, and let me tell you about the Osage oranges. Oh, and the other piece of this is that there were tribal leaders who were from the Ohio Territory, before it became the Ohio Territory. And there were all of these skirmishes in the 1790s because, George Washington and Jefferson, they wanted to go over the Appalachians and get that land. And they kept being pushed back by the British. And there were a number of battles after the Revolutionary War. And so these tribal leaders had come to try to deal with the situation, and they all died of smallpox. And so they're buried in the cemetery, but then, shortly thereafter, there was this battle of the fallen timbers, which again is more trees, but brought Ohio sort of into the territorial understanding. And Ohio is a really significant state in terms of not only like the Mississippian mound building cultures, and, that's something that Roz Ben talks about a lot, but also, the Rockefellers, Standard Oil being in Cleveland, and there were certain other aspects, like Akron is where the Knight Foundation, which is a newspaper company, but also augmented reality, really pushing IoT augmented reality. And then you have, I think Columbus is Battelle. Mm-hmm. So all of the early and then I didn't realize it till I started doing my atomic ecology work with Leo, but I think there were 60 Manhattan Project sites in Ohio, 60. Yeah. And one of them, the DuPont one outside of Dayton, was literally across the street from one of these really significant ceremonial mounds. So I just felt like this whole Ohio piece of that was significant as well. Like, so you've got the juxtaposition of the Biddles and the Indians and, Eliza Pinckney and these other people, that the story of that place, which is what I try to tell, is like putting it together.
Yeah. There's a lot of interesting things that go on in Ohio, a lot of interesting people from Ohio. My mom was born in Cleveland, actually in Euclid, which is a suburb that's kind of interesting. I was doing some research on it the other day with a client. We were doing some synchromysticism with, and we were looking at that area. But the cedars of Lebanon comes up over and over in things that we research, having seemingly obviously I was born at that hospital, but it's come up in various interesting ways. And we kind of periodically go back to it and try and understand like what is unique or interesting about the cedars of Lebanon, and that there's this secret degree of masonry that is with that title. They call it a side degree. Right? It's 34. Right. So it's after the 33rd. I think there's something interesting embedded there. I'm not sure yet what it is.
Well, I mean, it's certainly a choice. That's not a native tree. So someone decided to plant it there. And, I think it's probably somewhat of a subtle signaling, like if you knew, you would know, but if you didn't, it would just be a nice tree.
Yeah. That's the best. I mean, I think all of the keys that you're talking about. So, I mean, we talked about this when I talked to you last week. I think that like a lot of keys to doors that they're looking for lie within genetics, and they're very interested in collecting as much material and doing as much observation and data mining and all this stuff, like you say, but they're literally looking for the key or the needle in the haystack to open the various doors. But in the world that we all walk around and live in, a lot of these keys are hidden in plain sight. And if you have the eyes, or if you have the layer of knowledge or cryptography to steganography to sort of understand, it's in the landscape that the rest of us either enjoy or we find it ugly because they tore down our favorite old building or our favorite this, and they put this ugly thing there. But like weirdly, there's some symbol on the new building that was also on the old building. So even though it looks different, if you've got the eyes, you can see they're still saying this is the spot, dude. Right. So I think that's interesting. The other thing is I noticed there was a segment in your slide deck about cancer, and that seemed like an aside that I was like, whoa, okay, we were looking at this and now all of a sudden we're on cancer, the astrological symbol, not the disease.
Oh yeah. So that was the Zagar mural, I think. So I was going through the mosaic tiles and I just took pictures of all the things that were his technique. He would import pottery from Latin America. And so some of the stuff would be this imported pottery. Some of it would just be residential broken tile and mirrors. But then there would be unique ceramics that were often discs or painted, like either impressed into some sort of form or painted on top, that were, to me, seemed like there was messaging. So there were these crayfish in two of the medallions. And then so they were saying that the crayfish in Europe was the astrological symbol for cancer. And so I'm just trying to sort of like, and I guess it's also in one of the tarot deck. I don't know, is it the moon? There's something with the crayfish is in there as well. So that's where the cancer sort of fit in. I'm just like, what is he thinking about? So some of it is just, it's not a fully finished deck, but I'm like, there's got to be a meaning here. Why do you put 2 different tiles worth of crayfish on this wall?
I was trying to find that your presentation, which one is this your slide deck presentation? Yeah. Okay. But yeah, this is your Zagar one. I think this is different than the sugar. Oh, it's the same one.
Yeah. It's got the same kind of, I eventually just expanded it. I'm going to probably have to break it down, but if you wanted to show the sugarscape, the slide is right there.
Where is it?
Let me see. I think we just passed it. I think maybe go the other direction a little bit. It's yellow and red. It's pretty blatant.
I have it open on a different window.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I mean, that was so this was part of understanding the ant computer. Okay. And this idea of simulation programming based on basic rules, and it links back to game theory and John von Neumann and cellular automata, so that with multi-agent systems under simple rules, you can create complex phenomena, which is kind of all of this complexity theory and emergence. And so one of the models is the sugarscape computer simulation where there are rules regarding gathering food sources, which is the sugar. And so it'll run through the module until it runs out. And, you know, the rules are like, you know, yeah.
Let's find it. I thought I had it open in a different window, but I wanted to read it. It was interesting. And I had a thought. The reason I asked you about the cancer, by the way, while I look for it, if you see it, then holler at me. Was
there it is. 9.
There it is.
Number 9.
Number 9. Okay.
It doesn't really say much. It's the demonstration of it, but this is the sugar escape, how it.
There was one that had like a little paragraph about Santa Fe Institute. Where is it? Is it right now? No, it's not that one. It was, is it this? No, this. Okay.
Yeah.
We'll watch the sugar escape. The reason I asked you about the cancer just real quick was that I didn't know if you'd ever read Fritz Springmeier's book about the creation of a moonchild. Well, it's in that the creation of a total mind control slave, and he has his whole thing about the creation of a moonchild that gets into Cancer and Pisces, Moon and Pisces.
Oh no, I would be interested in that. Yeah,
it's available as a PDF online, or you can buy the book, but it's available as a PDF for free. I have it somewhere, but I think if you just type in that Fritz Springmeier creation of a moonchild or total mind control slave.
See, and I think the crayfish is in the moon card.
Yeah.
So interesting. Okay.
Check it out. There's some stuff in there that you have to get over if you're a specific kind of person like I am. And then there's other things in there that are quite interesting. Okay. So here we are at Danny and my favorite Santa Fe Institute. This may sound like science fiction, but a possible precursor to mimetic engineering has already been studied at the Santa Fe Institute. The 2050 project, an effort jointly pursued, I'm so glad you brought me back to this, by SFI and the World Resources Institute, used a computer modeling tool called Sugarscape to construct a cartoon history that mimics the true history of the ancient Native American tribes, such as the Anasazi, and then assesses the impact of changes in various cultural inputs, availability of resources, migration patterns, altered assumptions concerning diffusion of cultural mores on alternate histories that might have transpired but were foreclosed by intervening events in real history.
Yeah.
And then you have the little video here that shows how this Sugarscape works.
I don't think there's sound. It just moves around.
No
so these red dots on the yellow field, and they're eating sugar. And then I'm not sure how long it is, but eventually it kind of comes to some sort of. But it's all based on the programmable rules. And this is the thing that I've been trying to convey to people about, like, the central bank digital currency, is that it's about this. It's not about just we want to control you and make you miserable. It's about we want to coordinate the signals towards some goal that we're not aware of and that we won't be aware of what the ultimate goal is. So, but I had totally forgotten it was called Sugarscape. The one other thing I want to point out is the World Resources Institute there.
Yeah.
That is Stephen Ross and it's sustainable cities. And Stephen Ross made his fortune in affordable housing real estate, and then would leverage the revenue stream off the affordable housing to build luxury housing. He was the one who redeveloped Hudson Yards in New York. Climate countdown clock opposite Union Square. And the vessel, which is this sort of controversial structure in Hudson Yards, like, he commissioned that. So that Stephen Ross is working with Santa Fe Institute, on this model of the Anasazi is quite something.
There was one paper I looked at in relationship to something you sent me, and it was talking about, like, metabolism. Like, it was talking, right, with this. So what's interesting about this, I looked up the 2050 project. Right. It was something that was started in the 90s. And the way this is described, there was one of the things that you sent me that when I looked at it, it was talking about the metabolism, and that the people, like, in the Sugarscape would, like, their metabolism would be doing something that would make them seek out more resources, and they would go there and consume that and then just go on to the next place.
That's the rule. Yeah.
Okay. Right. So that is that was what it felt like when I was on this ride that I was on with the sugar and the drugs and whatever, right? That it was kind of like the point was for me to get to the place where there was lots of drugs or lots of sugar, consume those things, and network with a bunch of people that were also doing that, and then move on to the, it was a little bit different than like your average drug addict kind of life scenario, right? But I went to Santa Fe a bunch of times in the 90s, and a few other times since then. But I had this very strange trip with my grandmother to Santa Fe during the period of time when this project was getting going. And this thing that you say, right, that says right here, used a computer modeling tool called Sugarscape to construct a cartoon history. One of the strange features of like my mind during programming and then in the years since, as I've deprogrammed, is the amount of cartoon songs that run through my head. And the cartoon songs have incredibly weird information attached to them, like information about things that I don't know about, right? That I don't care about, that I don't think about, like exotic terms and ideas. But like when I look them up, they were a thing, right?
Wow.
And this cartoon, it like the way it was in quotes, I'm like, well, that's, I know other people who have the cartoon song thing. So I might be like, have the urge to sing or whistle like the Smurf song, but not with the words from the Smurfs. It was like other stuff, right? There's this place we went to in Santa Fe called the Inn of the Anasazi, right? It's like a hotel restaurant kind of place. And it always sticks out in my mind. Like I have a deep memory of going to the Inn of the Anasazi. But when I was looking up what Anasazi, more about the Anasazi, it took me to like all these places that my dad is completely obsessed with, like Canyon de Chelly. And there's literally like pictures of the same things he took pictures of. But their art, the Anasazis, I think the term Anasazi means the ancestors of my enemies. That's what the term Anasazi means. I looked it up earlier.
Huh.
You familiar with this? They changed the name from Anasazi to like ancient Pueblo people or something recently. But Anasazi means the ancestor of my enemies. And a lot of their artwork looks like the same thing that I've noticed with the Chumash that were in Chatsworth. The things looks like frequency readouts.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Right. And the stuff on their wall paintings looks very similar to some of the stuff on the Chatsworth wall paintings that all to me looks like symbols of things related to particle accelerators, nuclear reactors, things that we would consider modern space things. So why would they have been seeing them thousands of years ago? But I also noticed that the locations where the Anasazi were in limestone. Like all their stuff is carved. I opened a bunch of right before when I was preparing to talk to you. Let me see if I can find the thing I opened up on the Anasazi. Inn of the Anasazi. Here we go. They changed Anasazi to ancestral Pueblo people or something, right? Ancestral Puebloans, right? But this is all their little cities and things like that they built in Canyon de Chelly and other places in Colorado and in New Mexico and Utah.
I was at Hub and Weep. I went to Hub and Weep in December.
My dad loves, like my dad has like pictures. My dad likes to take pictures of doorways and old churches and all that kind of stuff. So literally in his office was a picture of that same location and whatnot. But these all these places were built out of limestone, which is the same thing that is around here. This is like one of the most fantastic things ever. If you look at some of this stuff.
Yeah, it's amazing.
It's like a whole city hidden underneath a rock.
You know,
that's pretty cool, right?
very cool.
But their art, I started looking at, I opened a window on Anasazi art. And I noticed that a lot of it looks like it's always like circular things connected to one each other going around. And like, sure, there's people like, oh, it's just how they did their art and stuff like that. But all of that stuff, if you look at the mock-ups of like particle accelerators and nuclear reactors, and some of these cave paintings look very similar to the one in Chatsworth in terms of what's on them. But all sorts of like labyrinths. This looks like a head-on of a particle accelerator. The same thing is on the wall in Chatsworth. They have these baskets that have that sort of vortexy chains all the way around them. They could look like frequency. There's one that looked like completely like an EKG or a frequency reading. Look at this one with what looks like an alien or
yeah, that's really
right? Or something. There was another one that had something really interesting on it. Let's see if I could find it. I can't find here's one with the wheel. This is on the one in Chatsworth also. There was one that I was looking at that looked so psychedelic and so labyrinthy, like I can't find it right now. But I'm starting to wonder about a lot of Native American, and I'm sure other indigenous cultural art that have lots of things like beating or these rows of connected cells or whatever, that if they're not trying to express some sort of frequency like measurement.
Yeah.
Right. I can't find the one that I was looking at that I was like, wow, this one is exactly like it.
Well,
But
you know, when in the fall, when I went to Tucson to give a talk for my friend Drew, it was interesting because what she was, she's involved in politics there, and she had been sent out for election day to go, and you know, they don't like her very much, so they sent her sort of far out into the reservations actually, and she's like, that's fine, because she's, you know, in descendant, you know, indigenous, so she went out, and like at the place, she noticed that there were these labyrinth, like circular labyrinth patterns of the Tohono O'odham, which are the original people of Tucson, and she was asking, and they're like, oh yeah, that's the man in the labyrinth, that's sort of our identity is this labyrinth. And so I was like, and I've been talking a lot about the labyrinth, like this is another way to do it instead of going to battle, like just understand we're in a labyrinth, we're navigating it, and then try to look at it with clarity so you don't get stuck in the labyrinth. You know, you can see it, but you can, and so it turns out literally like 5 miles from her house was a city park. And in the park, they had done a sculpture of a grandmother, and the pavement, and it's just like in a parking lot turnaround, literally, like with a few little bushes around the edge, they created the labyrinth on the ground, and then there's a figurative sculpture in the middle, and it's this grandmother figure who's holding a woven basket with the labyrinth up. So it's like this meta message of literally, I can be in the labyrinth and yet I can still control it and hold it. And so what's quite interesting is that this park is named after, gosh, now I'm totally like skitzing on the guy's name. It's a Odell. It's a powerful political family. They're actually, I think they might be LDS, and they were connected to in the environmentalism movement. And there were lots of them. There was like one in New Mexico and one in Colorado and one in Arizona. And
got it. Udall, almost exactly.
Udall, yes, the Udall Park. Yeah, the Morris K. Udall Park. Yeah. And I think if you might maybe put like Tonk Verde Road, if you put like Labyrinth, Morris or Udall Park, it will come. And it's quite, to me, like it's the way the land tells you the picture. Like it's literally, and Drew, who had lived in Tucson since forever, like she wasn't aware of the story, and that it intersected with literally how I had been starting to talk about this thing as navigating the labyrinth. But like the upper left picture, that's the one, the park, and you can see this figure in the middle. And this is from the back, but the fourth row down on the left is her holding the basket, the figurative. Yeah. So she's in the labyrinth and yet she's holding the labyrinth. That basket is woven with the labyrinth in it. And then there's these, I think probably like artifacts at her feet that have meaning if you understand how to interpret them. But you can see it's just in the middle of a car park. You know what I mean? It's the strangest thing. And so I feel like, you know, we walked the labyrinth, and it's interesting because I sat in intention there, and my friend Jason had given me these quote unquote green pill socks because he had been filming and at this thing, and like the blockchain conferences in Boulder or Denver or Boulder, and the people who are doing this regenerative finance on the blockchain, the key guy behind it, and he's part of this cybernetic token engineering thing. He does this green pill podcast. It's the green pill, and you know, trying to make it all normal. So Jason somehow acquired a pair of these green pill socks. So we set an intention like at the labyrinth with the green pill socks on the heart of the little person who's standing outside. And like even several days later, I came back with Drew because I'm like, you really have to see this. Like when you're feeling down, you should just go like kind of walk this labyrinth, because I feel like this is a signal. And it was still there. And she's like, yeah, here, like people understand about intentions being, they don't mess it up. So anyway, so I left one of the pair of green pill socks at the Labyrinth.
Yeah, I think that there's something to that. Like, I think that I think there are energetic locations all over the place, but certain ones are specific, that have been there for a really long time. And certain individuals just feel that more when they sort of go to some of these places, but there's something there. And I think these labyrinths, whether they be naturally occurring or created, right, they do sort of open up a space that bridges the gap between things that we think of as being far away, either in time or in space, and they sort of stack it all on top of each other. And when you're doing that, when you're holding it and being in it, you kind of have the freedom to sort of move up and down in that. And I think that that is really what a lot of these indigenous or, ancient cultural tribal rituals or ceremonies are about, is not just like remembering the people that came before them, but literally sort of visiting them in that way, or right, like of bringing all time sort of in and being able to move around in that. And some of those rituals involve substances that are often like bark from the tree there. Like, I don't know if you know what iboga is. Like, that is tree bark from a place in Africa that has properties that they want to isolate for drug addiction and but seems to have a time travel component to it. Like, it seems to be like suddenly you're back 100 years ago with whatever type of thing, right? And certain kinds of DMT can be extracted from tree bark. So these references to things like cedars of Lebanon or different bushes or different trees within these cultures, that may be the tea they drink in order to sort of have that sort of sacred connective ceremony or ritual.
In controlling time, because I think that's also a Western idea of like creating the clocks and the watches and the things to keep the time. And again, the Swiss and the blockchains, and, in New York, the Stephen Ross has this countdown clock that's a digital clock built in. And once you step outside of the timing sequence, like once you don't have instruments of time, it's literally the natural cycles. And so time, I think, becomes much more fluid when you step out of the mechanics of it. It's not as hard and fast as it is when you're on, a calendar schedule. I mean, and I've noticed this since I stopped working my regular job, is that things are just much more fluid. It's just you wake up and it's today,
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think that time is the main sort of containing thing of whatever we're in. Like, that seems to be like the main component of the prison or whatever, to the extent that there is one, because we worry about being there on time, running out of time. How do we spend our time? Do we waste time? Do we, all of that kind of.
I want to go back through the OA and look at the clocks, because I noticed that's the other thing about morphogenesis that I've realized is the development of the organism from the cells is that it's based in oscillation. The communications are happening. So, anyway, I think the timing and frequency, but I know you probably got to move on to your.
Run a minute, but before we do it, I used to live in Tucson. I lived in Tucson for a year, in like 1996, 97 period of time. And I just did a show where we got a lot into Tucson with my friend Alisa E, who I've mentioned to you. And Tucson has a lot of interesting things going on.
L5, like the L5 Society.
What's that?
You're familiar with the L5 Society.
What is that?
The space colonization people, and Catherine Meinel and her father Aidan, who was the head of the astronomy and the astrophysics and high up in the photonics. It's just like capital L5 Society.
Okay,
and they had very high level politicians involved. I went there in Tucson. It's just like this little garage. I got the address off of, it was she and her husband, and they were consulting with this physicist in Princeton about like space colonization. They were the main advocates for space colonization in the 70s.
Well, that's interesting, because kind of the takeaway from the show I did recently with Alisa was about Tucson being really like the anchor for the idea of like Stargate project or something.
I think so. Well, and later, but Stuart Hameroff and the consciousness stuff with Roger Penrose, quantum consciousness, and a lot of that money was coming in from the Fetzer Institute, and Jim Fetzer wintered in Tucson.
Jim Fetzer, the Jim Fetzer who like ruins everything.
I mean, he would like the Fetzer. He was the radio frequency guy.
Oh, that's not the one I'm talking about.
Yeah, no, Jim Fetzer. He was a spiritualist, and
I'm talking about the Jim Fetzer who invades like every like he did the Sandy Hook school shooting and the night, all that kind of stuff. Like,
everyone. No, different. He's been dead for a bit, like since like around the time you were there. But no, the Fetzer Institute, because he works with the Templeton. Well, he's now dead, but his money, and the John Templeton money go together to work on this weird intersection of high level physics and religion and free markets and like genius. Like across these really strange, like, because I think they want to use the markets to evolve our psyche somehow.
There's a guy, I can't remember his name right now. Gaetan, when you hear this, remind me of his name. He was like some guy who like used his own form of like astrology to predict the market. His name, I can't think of his name right now, but something you said last time made me think of him too. And I was trying to look him up, but I can't remember his name. But he had some similar idea, right? That they kind of looked at his work and they're trying to use that to sort of evolve things that way. But yeah, Tucson is a very interesting place. And I didn't understand synchromystics mysticism when I lived there, but it's been fun to look back at my time there with the things I know now and realize that like I was doing the mystical toponymy thing there, like everything, like literally I could show you this, it would fucking laugh, but like I literally live. So when I lived in Tucson in 1996, I lived on River Road and Oracle Estates was right above me. Oh. I live in Austin on the river, right off of Riverside, and Oracle headquarters is right next door to me right now. And there I lived right above the river, and here I live below the river, and they're like reversed. So it's like mirrored where they are. Like one was above me and one is like below me and whatnot, right? And it's just like all the same names of the streets were all around. And it's like, I've been like moving around in the candy land. Well, Alison, I totally enjoyed this. I have some friends in town. We're going to go to dinner. I'm happy to have chats with you about anything, anytime. And your slide deck that I got to see is really cool. And so when you decide to put something out with that, I would love to just, maybe that would help us to like, you and I can do the brain thing of jumping all around like this, but I would love to do a segment with you on some of your slideshow where I would remember some of the stories that each thing made me think, because
that would be cool. Yeah, I'm going to try to walk through it. I might chunk it into different bits, but then maybe we can revisit like with the addition of your perspective. Because again, you can take one thing and everybody has a different story to bring to the different parts.
Well, like when I watched Away, it just completely resonated with me as to like processes that I'd been through. And particularly the way that the dance moves were central to them being able to move between spaces and dimensions.
Oh,
like, that's been a huge... Yeah, it's been a huge part of my life. Like with the day I told you, like I like to go to underground parties, but I don't just like to do drugs and listen to repetitive music. Like I'm a very active dancer, and all of the experiences that I've had that have felt sort of transcendent have involved very similar movement to that. Right. And so that combined with the sugar and the sleep and the Elisa Lam and all the weird things that were going on, that show really resonated. So I think that a lot of the connections you make based on your own research are really right. And I can complement that for you experientially, which I think always like helps to sort of bring a certain, it's different than you're just like, I think they're going to do this based on these documents. You're like, but I think, you've got it, right? That's the way that they're going in the digital realm is like, they've observed something in the real world, and now they're trying to bring it into a contained scenario that they control. But the design for that comes from something that they did in the real world. And the people that my own experiences, and then the others that I've been talking to for years and years and years, have been through some of these processes that I literally think that they've now created algorithms and software and tests and things like that based on. And so it's amazing that you can get to the same place digitally or genetically or nuclearly, but not with nuclear. I'd love to talk to your friend that has been researching radiation and the history of radiation because I'm super focused on that. So if you can make that.
Oh, okay. All right. Yeah. I can see about connecting you. So cool.
Awesome. Okay.
All right. Well, have a good weekend.
Thank you. You too. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.